3 armed deputies, 1 woman, 0 fear. She sat in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car while the Texas sun hammered the cracked asphalt outside Oak Haven's only diner. No tears, no argument, no panic in her eyes. Just a cold, measured stillness that made the deputy riding shotgun grip his door handle a little tighter than he needed to. Sheriff Boyd Miller thought he'd caught himself an easy mark. A drifter. A nobody. Someone the system would swallow and forget. He'd never been more wrong in his life. She wasn't hiding. She was watching. And before this night was over, every man in that building was going to understand exactly what they'd done. Not when she told them, but when the walls came down around them. If this kind of story hits different for you, subscribe right now. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button, because you do not want to miss what comes next. The diner had one of those names that tried too hard, Lone Star Junction, painted in sun-bleached red letters above a door that didn't quite close flush with the frame. The sign in the window advertised hot coffee and homemade pie. Both were technically accurate. The coffee tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, and the pie, well, the pie was fine. Cherry, the kind of fine that didn't ask anything of you. Alice Reese had been sitting at table 7 for 40 minutes. She'd chosen the seat deliberately. Corner booth, back to the wall, clear sightline to the front entrance, the side hallway leading to the kitchen, and the parking lot through a smudged window on her left. Old habit, the kind that didn't switch off just because you were on leave. She was on her 3rd cup of the bad coffee and had eaten maybe half the cherry pie, mostly because she hadn't eaten since a gas station outside of Lubbock the previous afternoon. She wasn't hungry exactly. She was the kind of tired that sits in your bones and tells you food is maintenance, not pleasure. Her duffel was on the bench seat beside her, olive green, worn at the shoulder strap, with a small bleach stain near the bottom left corner from a decontamination scrub she'd done in a bathroom. 3 time zones and a lifetime ago. Inside, a change of clothes, a waterproof field notebook with nothing written in it, a sat phone that was currently switched off, and a toiletry bag that held, among the usual things, a flat aluminum case with a medical kit she'd assembled herself because the standard issue ones were always missing the right hemostatic gauze. No weapon. She was stateside, on administrative leave following the terms of her post-mission protocol. No weapon was one of the terms. She hadn't liked signing that line, but she'd signed it. Outside, her 1994 Ford Bronco sat in the far corner of the parking lot, pointed toward the exit. Also habit. The vehicle was dusty in a way that suggested distance rather than neglect. The difference between a car that hasn't been washed and a car that has been driven. The paint was faded along the hood, and there was a small dent in the rear bumper from a night in Kandahar she didn't particularly feel like remembering today. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window. Highway 87 was mostly empty at this hour. A livestock truck had rumbled through 20 minutes ago, heading south. A family in a minivan had stopped, refueled at the station next door, and kept moving without coming inside. Smart. The kind of unspoken read that families on long drives develop. This place feels off. Keep going. Alice didn't have the luxury of that instinct pulling her forward. She was going nowhere specific. Administrative leave was military language for stay out of trouble and wait for us to call you back. She'd been given 60 days. She was on day 9, and she'd already driven through 3 states. Oak Haven wasn't a destination. It was just where she'd stopped. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s named Darlene, based on her name tag, with the kind of face that had seen enough not to be surprised by much, had stopped refilling the coffee 20 minutes ago. Not rudely. She'd just quietly assessed that this particular customer was not someone who needed hovering over. That read, Alice appreciated. The diner itself had maybe 6 other customers, a trucker eating alone at the counter, nursing a hamburger with the dedication of a man doing work. 2 middle-aged women sharing a piece of cake and talking low about something that made one of them shake her head slowly. A teenage couple in the back booth who hadn't touched their food and were deep in whatever argument teenagers have that feels at the time like the most important thing in the world. And a man at the counter who'd been nursing a cup of coffee for the same 40 minutes Alice had been here. He hadn't eaten. He had a newspaper, but he'd been on the same page since she sat down. He kept his shoulders squared to the door and checked the parking lot window every few minutes in a pattern that was too regular to be casual. She'd clocked him at minute 12. Not law enforcement. The posture was wrong, too rigid in the wrong places, not the settled authority of someone used to wearing a badge, but affiliated, or waiting. His boots were clean in the way that people who want to look like they work outdoors sometimes clean their boots. Deliberately, not practically. She didn't move. She just filed it and let the coffee cool another quarter inch. The black and white rolled into the parking lot at 4:17 in the afternoon. One unit, which became two, which became three inside of 90 seconds. The kind of arrival that was choreographed. Planned. Not a response to a call, but the execution of something decided before anyone ever walked through that diner door. Alice watched the vehicles park without moving her hands from the mug. The man at the counter stood up, folded his newspaper, and left $2 on the counter. He didn't look at her. He walked to the door and held it open from the outside as two uniformed deputies came through. Behind them, another man in plain clothes, mid-40s, federal cut to his jacket, DEA credential already in hand, held slightly too high, the way people hold credentials when they want the room to see them before they need to show anyone specifically. Sheriff Boyd Miller came in last. Alice had met men like Miller before. Not this exact man. She'd have remembered the gut that strained his shirt buttons and the mustache that was doing apologetic work on a face that needed more than grooming could provide. But the type. Men who'd operated in systems long enough to believe the system existed for their benefit. Who confused institutional authority with personal power and had stopped noticing the difference somewhere around year 12. He walked to table 7 with the rolling gait of someone who never moved faster than he decided to. "Alice Reese," he said. Not a question. She looked up from her coffee. She didn't answer. "You're going to want to put that cup down," he said. "I'm not done with it." The deputy on Miller's left, young, maybe 23, with the look of someone who'd joined up for the structure and was already learning what the structure actually required, shifted his weight from his right foot to his left. The one on the right was older, thicker in the neck, comfortable with whatever was happening. He had the casual ease of someone who'd done this version of the job before. Miller pulled out the chair across from Alice and sat down without being invited. He put both forearms on the table and leaned in about 6 inches, close enough to establish dominance, far enough to be deniable about it. "Going to make this simple," he said. "Got a report. Vehicle matching yours, plates matching yours, was involved in a contraband transport earlier this week. I need you to come with us." "Who made the report?" Alice said. "That's an ongoing investigation matter. When did this transport supposedly happen?" "I'm not here to answer questions." "What contraband?" "Ma'am, what contraband?" she said again. Same tone, same pace, like she was asking about the weather. Miller's jaw tightened slightly at the edges. "Controlled substances. Significant quantity. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up, you're going to come outside with my deputies, and we're going to search that vehicle." Alice set the coffee down. She looked at Miller. She looked at the DEA agent. Granger, she'd learn later, though right now he was just plainclothes federal with something to prove. And she looked at the two deputies, spending an extra half-second on the young one. "I want to be very clear," she said, "that I am cooperating under protest, that I am not consenting to a search, and that I want to know the legal basis for the stop before we go another step." Miller smiled. Not warmly. "That's your right. You can take that up with the judge, right?" He nodded at the deputies. The older one came around the table. The younger one followed, and she watched his hands, fingers splayed slightly, not making a fist, not ready to grab. He was uncomfortable. That registered. She stood before they reached her, didn't wait to be pulled, picked up her duffel from the bench. "Leave the bag," the older deputy said. She looked at him. "There's nothing in it." "Leave it anyway." She set it on the table, kept her hands visible, let them lead her out into the Texas heat. The parking lot felt different once she was standing in it. The 3 patrol units had blocked her Bronco in at 3 angles, and a 4th vehicle, unmarked, dark blue, the DEA agent's ride, was parked at the lot entrance. The man from the counter was leaning against one of the patrol cars, arms crossed, watching her with the flat patience of someone being paid by the hour. She kept her face forward and her breathing steady. They walked her past her Bronco without stopping, which told her something. They weren't actually going to search it out here. Not yet. This was for optics. For the small crowd of people who drifted to the diner windows or paused on the sidewalk across the street. Public arrest first, then the search. staged. She cataloged it the same way she cataloged everything. Not with anger, not yet with a plan, just with the automatic operational discipline of someone who'd spent years in environments where the gap between observation and survival was measured in seconds. The cuffs went on her wrists behind her back. Standard double lock. The older deputy did it, practiced, no hesitation. She let him. She kept her wrists slightly apart as they closed, creating a millimeter of slack. Also habit. Didn't mean she planned to use it. Just meant she planned to have options. The walk to the patrol car was maybe 30 feet. Darlene was standing in the diner doorway with a dish towel and an expression that wanted to say something but had learned, over a long career in this town, when saying something cost too much. The teenage boy from the back booth had his phone out. Alice noted that too. Oka Haven's Sheriff's Department was a flat, single-story building the color of old cardboard 2 blocks from the diner, set between a feed store and a closed insurance office, whose windows had been papered over with newsprint. The parking lot held 4 vehicles, including the ones that had just arrived. The building had 4 surveillance cameras mounted at the eaves, 2 of which appeared functional based on the indicator lights, and one of which had its lens cracked and was probably pulling nothing but noise. She cataloged all of this in the 90 seconds it took to walk from the patrol car to the front entrance. Inside, a front desk with a dispatcher who looked at Alice once and then immediately looked back at her screen. A hallway left toward what smelled like a break room, a hallway right toward the holding area, and straight ahead, through a door with a reinforced window, the interrogation room. They took her straight. The room was maybe 10 by 12, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a wall-mounted camera in the corner. She checked for the recording light before she sat, found it lit, red, and steady. An HVAC vent above the door that rattled every 30 seconds in a rhythm that was probably maddening over hours and had become white noise to anyone who worked here. Fluorescent light overhead with a slight flicker in the 3rd tube. She sat. They left her there for 22 minutes. She knew because she counted. Granger came in without Miller. He was carrying a manila folder, which he set on the table without opening it. He sat across from her, adjusted his chair, and spent a moment organizing himself in the particular way that men who've done interrogation training organize themselves. Establishing comfort, establishing control of the space, establishing that he was the one not in a hurry. She watched him do all of this and said nothing. "Okay," he said finally. "My name is Agent Thomas Granger, DEA. You've been detained in connection with an ongoing investigation into controlled substance trafficking. Before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity." "Am I under arrest?" Alice said. Slight pause. "You're being detained." "That's not what I asked. Am I under arrest?" "We're still—" "Then I want to leave." "Ms. Reese?" He folded his hands on the folder. "I understand you're frustrated, but the best thing you can do right now is work with me. Tell me where you've been, where you're going, who you've been in contact with. Because the vehicle we stopped, the plates we ran, this is already a problem for you. How big a problem depends on what you say in this room." Alice looked at him. She looked at the way he held his hands, knuckles slightly white, fingers pressed together harder than the casual pose was supposed to suggest. She looked at the folder, which had no visible case number on the tab. She looked at the slight shine of perspiration at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. "I'd like an attorney," she said. Granger leaned back. "That's absolutely your right." He didn't move toward the door. "Call 1, she said. "We'll get to that." He opened the folder. Inside, a photograph of her Bronco, taken in this parking lot today, which meant the photo had been prepared in advance or taken within the last 30 minutes and already printed, neither of which was routine. And a document, a typed statement, already partially completed, with a blank line near the bottom and a pen placed across it. "I want you to look at this," he said. She looked. It was a confession of voluntary cooperation in a contraband transport operation, with her name already typed in 3 places and her supposed vehicle information filled in. The language was specific enough to suggest someone had spent time on it and vague enough to survive a preliminary legal challenge. "Sign this," Granger said, "and we can talk about how this goes forward. The DA in this county works with cooperative subjects. You could be out of here." "No," Alice said. He left the paper on the table. She didn't look at it again. Miller came in an hour later. He pulled the second chair around so he was sitting beside her rather than across from her. a classic pressure technique, eliminating the table as a barrier, entering her physical space. She adjusted her posture without making it obvious, creating distance without creating confrontation. "Here's the thing, Ms. Reese," he said. He had a cup of coffee, his own, not hers, and he set it on the table between them like a prop. "I've been doing this job in this county for 19 years. I know how people move through here. I know what the highway brings. And I know that when somebody's sitting alone in a diner at 4 in the afternoon, picking at food they're not eating, watching every door like they're waiting for something, that's not a tourist. That's not somebody just passing through." He waited, apparently expecting a response. She didn't give him one. "You've got priors," he said. She had no priors. Whatever he'd pulled or invented wasn't real. "You've got a vehicle that fits a description from a case that crosses 3 states. Her vehicle didn't fit anything, because nothing had happened in 3 states. "And you've got an attitude, which I actually respect. I do. But it's not going to help you in front of a judge in this county who knows me personally and has processed about 200 cases in the last 4 years where my testimony was the centerpiece." Alice looked at the wall. "So what I'm asking you," Miller said, leaning in slightly, "is to make a choice. Because right now, this is still small. Right now, this is still manageable. But if we have to take this to the next level, search the vehicle formally, run everything through the federal system, involve the DA. It gets big very fast. And big means years, not months. Big means your life, whatever life you've got, gets complicated in ways you cannot undo." The HVAC vent rattled above the door. Once, twice, then silence. "I'd like water," Alice said. Miller stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his shirt. The bottom button was slightly strained, she noticed, picked up his coffee, and walked to the door. "Think about it," he said without turning around. The door closed. She sat alone and let herself breathe for the first time since the parking lot. Not visible breathing, not the kind that would show on the camera, but internal. A slow, controlled descent of the chest that she'd learned in a windowless building outside Fort Bragg from a physiologist who specialized in stress response management and had never once used the word calm because he said calm was a destination and management was a practice. She assessed. She was in a single-story structure. She had not been formally booked. They had not processed her fingerprints yet, which meant they were either working toward it or they had a reason to delay. Her vehicle was presumably still in the diner parking lot, which meant it was accessible to them without a formal warrant if they chose to move quickly. And she had to assume they were moving quickly. She had no phone. Her duffel was still in the diner, which meant whatever was in it was accessible to them. Nothing in the duffel mattered, practically. But the sat phone. The sat phone was switched off and had a hardware encryption module that would require her biometric to unlock. They couldn't access it without her, but the moment they formally booked her, they would run her prints. She needed to think carefully about what happened when they ran her prints. It wasn't that she was worried about what they'd find. It was that she was thinking very precisely about the sequence of events that would follow and how long that sequence would take, and whether she needed to affect that timeline in any way or simply wait. She decided to wait. She looked at the camera in the corner. She looked at the signed confession paper still sitting on the table, and she turned it face down with 2 fingers slowly, making sure it was visible in the camera frame. Then she folded her hands and sat with the particular stillness of someone who has spent significant stretches of time waiting in places much more uncomfortable than this. They came for her fingerprints at 6:44 p.m. Granger, with the older deputy for physical compliance, and a young female technician carrying a tablet-based scanning unit, civilian, not law enforcement, probably contracted, slightly nervous in the way people get when the situation they've walked into feels different than what they were told. They didn't unhandcuff her fully. One wrist released, guided to the scanner, returned. Professional enough. The technician pressed each finger with the care of someone who needed clean reads and was worried about getting them. The scan completed. The system processed. Granger was watching the tablet over the technician's shoulder when the result came back. Alice watched Granger's face. She saw the moment it changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the wide-eyed shock of movies. It was subtler than that. A micro-expression, half a second. The face doing an involuntary recalibration when the information it received didn't match the reality it had built. His chin dropped a fraction. His eyes moved to her and then immediately away. The technician made a sound, not a word exactly, just a short, sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" Granger said. His voice had dropped half a register. The technician turned the tablet slightly to show him the screen. Alice kept her expression neutral. Whatever they were seeing, and she knew, roughly, what they were seeing, the flags that attached to her profile and the access restrictions and the federal designations that came with her clearance tier. Whatever it was, it had altered the temperature of the room in a way that Granger was clearly struggling to process. He looked at her again. Really looked, this time. The kind of look that was reevaluating everything backward from this point. "Step out," he told the technician. She stepped out quickly, with the energy of someone grateful for an exit. Granger stood there, just the deputy and him, and Alice with her wrists recuffed, sitting in a chair in a room that had been designed for a very different kind of person than the one currently sitting in it. "Ms. Reese?" Granger said slowly. She said nothing. He pulled the tablet back toward himself, looked at the screen again. His jaw worked once, the way jaws do when a person is choosing between several things to say and rejecting each one. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "That's a good idea," Alice said. He walked to the door. Just before he opened it, she said, "Make sure you call from inside the building." He looked at her. "Cell reception out front isn't great," she said. "You'll want a landline." Granger held her gaze for a moment, trying to read something in her face. She could see him trying. And then he pushed through the door and was gone. The older deputy remained. He stood by the door with his hands at his sides and looked at a spot on the wall slightly above Alice's head and said nothing. From somewhere down the hall, she could hear the faint sound of raised voices. Miller and Granger. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the cadence. Granger's voice controlled, tight. Miller's rising on the third or fourth exchange. The register of someone confronting information he hadn't agreed to deal with today. The HVAC vent rattled. The fluorescent tube in the far corner flickered twice. Alice looked at the camera in the corner of the room. The red recording light was still steady. She hoped someone was watching the feed. Outside the building's single reinforced window, the Texas sky had gone the particular shade of deep orange that happens in flat country when the sun drops behind nothing. No mountains, no tree line, just the slow hemorrhage of the day into night. She had been in the building for 2 hours and 27 minutes. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even. And in the hallway, the voices had gone quiet. Which was, she'd learned this particular silence in enough hallways, in enough buildings, on enough continents, usually when things got interesting. The silence in the hallway lasted maybe 4 minutes. Then Miller's voice came back, lower this time, stripped of the theatrical patience he'd used in the interrogation room, down to something rawer and less managed. Alice couldn't make out individual words through the reinforced door, but she could read the rhythm of it. A man recalculating, arguing with someone who wasn't agreeing with his recalculation, and losing. The deputy by the door heard it too. His eyes moved once toward the hallway, and then came back to the wall above Alice's head. His right hand had drifted toward his belt, not toward the weapon, just toward the radio. The way hands move when bodies want something to hold on to. Alice watched the camera light. Still red, still recording. She thought about the technician with the tablet, the civilian contractor who had walked into a routine booking and walked out of something else. That woman would be in her car by now, or trying to be, or making a phone call she hadn't planned to make tonight. People who didn't belong to institutions found their way out of uncomfortable situations faster than the people who did, because they had less invested in pretending the situation was normal. The voices stopped. A door opened and closed somewhere deeper in the building. Footsteps. Miller's. She recognized the slightly uneven rhythm of a man who favored his left knee, moving away toward what she estimated was the rear of the building. Then nothing. The deputy shifted his weight. "You want water," he said. Not warmly, not unkindly, just the offering of something to do. "Still yes," Alice said. He hesitated. Leaving the room meant leaving her unattended, and leaving her unattended was a judgment call he clearly hadn't been briefed on. And then he made the decision by stepping into the hallway and calling quietly for someone named Reyes. A younger voice answered. Another deputy, apparently appearing quickly enough that he'd been nearby, which meant Miller had positioned extra personnel in the building. More staging, more preparation. This had been planned in layers, and Alice was only seeing the surface of it. The door stayed open while the first deputy remained in the hallway, and the younger one came in with a plastic cup of water from a cooler. He set it on the table and backed out without making eye contact. Alice picked up the cup with both cuffed hands. Drank half. Set it down. Her wrists were beginning to ache from the cuffs. Not severely, but the kind of low-grade persistent discomfort that, over hours, became its own form of pressure. She rotated them slightly inside the steel, carefully, in a way the camera wouldn't catch as deliberate. Granger came back at 7:22. He was alone this time, which was different, and he'd lost the folder, left it somewhere, or decided the prop wasn't working anymore. He sat down across from her in the chair Miller had been using, pulled it back to the correct side of the table rather than the pressure position, and looked at her with an expression that had shifted from interrogatory confidence to something that was trying very hard to look like professional neutrality. It wasn't quite getting there. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Is there someone you're expecting to contact you? Someone who might be trying to reach you right now?" Alice looked at him. "Why?" "Just background. Routine." "That's not routine," she said. "You ran my prints. Something came back. And now you want to know if someone is looking for me." She let a beat pass. "Those aren't connected questions." Granger's jaw tightened slightly. He was good at keeping his face still, better than Miller, but the jaw was the tell. It always moved when he was deciding how much to say. "The system flagged your profile," he said carefully. "There are some federal designations attached to your record that require us to follow additional protocols." "What protocols?" "Verification protocols. We need to confirm your identity through secondary channels. You have my fingerprints. The prints confirm the name. The designations attached to that name require independent verification," Alice said. He stopped. "You can't just call whoever you'd normally call," she said, "because whoever you'd normally call doesn't have the access tier to get information about what came back. So you're waiting for someone to call you." She picked up the water cup again. "How long have they said it'll take?" Granger looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite respect, not quite alarm, something in the middle that people sometimes arrived at when they realized they'd been reading a situation backward. "You seem very calm about this," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." "Most people in your position?" "I'm not most people in my position," Alice said. "That's what the flag said, isn't it?" He didn't answer. She set down the cup. "You need to formally book me or release me. Detention without charge has a clock, Agent Granger, and I will tell you, as clearly as I can, that the clock is something you should be paying attention to." He stood up. He did it carefully. The way people stand up when they're trying not to look like standing up is a retreat. "Sit tight," he said, which was an unfortunate phrase to use with someone in handcuffs, and he seemed to realize it a half second after saying it because something moved across his face. He left. The door closed. The lock engaged. Alice looked at the camera. The red light pulsed once, just a flicker, probably the connection, possibly the recorder hiccuping, and then went steady again. She settled back into her chair and returned to counting. Well, at 8:05 p.m., they moved her to a holding cell. Not a cell exactly, a room with a reinforced door and a cot bolted to the wall, and a toilet behind a half partition, and no camera, which was either an oversight or a decision. The window was one of those frosted glass blocks set high in the wall, the kind that let light in without letting vision out. It was dark now, so the window was just a gray square at the top of a concrete wall. The older deputy, she'd heard another officer call him Briggs, which fit him, processed her personal property in the hallway before putting her in. Phone, wallet, keys. He inventoried them in a ledger, old school, with a pen. When he got to the keys, he held up the Bronco's key fob and looked at it for a moment like he was trying to figure out where she was parking it in his mental map of the situation. "Vehicles in our impound lot," he said. Standard line. She didn't react. He put her in the cell and the door closed, and she sat on the cot and took her first full slow breath of the evening. The cot was better than some places she'd slept. The mattress was the thin blue vinyl kind that squeaked with every movement and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old exhaustion. The accumulated weight of every person who'd lain on it and stared at this exact ceiling. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. A water stain in the shape of something that might have been a dog if you were charitable, spread from the corner above the door. She ran the operation in her head. Not hers, theirs, Miller's. She was building it from the pieces she'd collected since the parking lot. The staged vehicles, the pre-positioned man at the diner counter, the already printed confession document, the civilian tech brought in for expedited fingerprinting, the fact that they'd run her plates before entering the diner. This wasn't reactive. This was a machine with moving parts that had been in motion before she pulled off Highway 87, which meant she had been selected. Not randomly. Not because her Bronco fit a description or because someone had called in a tip. She had been selected, which required someone to know she was coming through, which required information about her route, which required either surveillance or a source. She didn't have enemies, precisely. That wasn't quite the right word. She had people who would benefit from her being unavailable, which was a different thing, more clinical, more operational, and considerably more concerning. She filed that problem for later. The immediate problem was simpler. Miller and Granger were running a local corruption operation that targeted travelers passing through, and they had made a significant tactical error by selecting her. And the error was going to surface within a predictable time frame, and her job between now and then was to stay calm, stay observant, and not give them anything they could use. She'd been in worse rooms. She closed her eyes and slowed her breathing to sleep rate without actually sleeping, a trick that took years to learn and served, among other things, as the only rest available in environments where actual sleep was tactically inadvisable. She listened. The building was quieter at night, skeleton crew. She could track 2, maybe 3 people moving through the structure based on footfalls and door patterns. Dispatch was probably still active at the front desk. She heard a radio once, briefly, the squawk and crackle of a call going out or coming in. At some point past 9, she heard a phone ring in what she estimated was Miller's office. 3 rings, then silence, then the low sound of a voice that went on for some time. She couldn't make out words. She focused on duration and tone. Duration, long. The person on the other end was doing most of the talking. Tone, the voice she could hear, Miller's, shifted from its usual rolling authority down through something more constrained and then into what she could only characterize as careful. The voice of a man choosing words rather than using them. The call ended. Footsteps. Closer. They stopped outside her cell door. A long pause, the kind that happens when someone is standing on the other side of something deciding whether to open it. Then they moved away. Granger came to the cell door at 10:17. He didn't open it. He stood at the door with the window, the small, reinforced glass square at eye height, and she could see his face through it, flatly lit by the hallway fluorescence, looking like he'd had a version of a bad evening. She stood from the cot and walked to the door. They looked at each other through the glass. "I've been authorized to tell you," he said, speaking through the door so his voice came slightly muffled, "that there will be verification contact tomorrow morning, a federal liaison." "From which agency?" Alice said. "I'm not at liberty." "Granger." She said his name evenly, without edge. "You ran my prints. You got a flag. You made calls, and the people you called made calls, and eventually those calls went somewhere that told you to sit on this until morning and wait for someone to come out here and tell you what to do." She watched his face through the glass. "I understand the position you're in. I'm telling you, as clearly as I can, that the morning conversation is not going to go the way you're currently expecting it to go." "Is that a threat?" "No," she said. "It's information. You can do whatever you want with it." He looked at her for another moment. Behind his eyes, something was working. She could see the gears. A man who was good at his job, probably, who had started doing something that wasn't his job, and was currently somewhere in the process of understanding that. "What are you?" he said. And the way he said it wasn't aggressive. It was almost genuine. A real question from someone who'd run out of the framework he usually operated in. Alice looked at him through the reinforced glass. "I'm someone you stopped at a diner," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he walked away. Oh, she slept. Actually slept. 2 hours, maybe 2.5. The light, surface-level sleep of trained discipline that left the subconscious running watch while the body recovered what it could. She woke at 1:13 a.m. by the positioning of the light from the corridor, not because anything had changed, but because her internal clock said it was time. The building was quiet. One set of footsteps at irregular intervals. One person doing rounds, which was standard for a small-town department overnight. The rounds followed a pattern she'd mapped by the third pass. Front desk, hallway left, back to front, hallway right, front desk. Every 18 to 20 minutes. She sat on the edge of the cot and waited out 2 more rounds. On the third, during the gap when the officer was at the far end of the left hallway, she heard something. Outside. Not inside. She moved to the frosted window. It was too high on the wall to look through even standing, but sound came through the gap around the frame where the seal had long since compressed and cracked. She stood directly beneath it and listened. A vehicle. Moving slowly. Not on the main road, that was to the east, and this was coming from the west, from the access road that ran behind the building to the impound lot and the county maintenance yard. Moving slowly and without lights, because she could hear the engine but not the accompanying sound of gravel being scattered the way it was when someone drove normally on that surface, someone picking their way carefully. The vehicle stopped. The engine shut off. Silence. Then, faint, directional, the soft sound of footsteps on gravel. More than one set. Moving toward the building. Alice stood perfectly still beneath the window. The footsteps stopped. Then, from much closer than she expected, a short sound, low, controlled, the kind of sound that equipment makes when someone handles it in the dark with gloves on, the scrape and click of something being attached to something else. She stepped back from the window, stood in the center of the cell. She'd spent enough time on the other side of this kind of operation to recognize what she was hearing. The question was whether what was coming through that wall in the next few minutes was an extraction or something else. She stood still and listened and kept her breathing level and thought very carefully about the difference. At 2:04 a.m. the lights went out. Not just the cell, the building, everything. The fluorescent strip under the cell door went dark. The small emergency indicator on the smoke detector in the corner of the ceiling switched from green to a pulsing red that lasted approximately 4 seconds before it too died, which meant whatever had cut the power had also neutralized the backup circuit. Professional. She heard, from the front of this building, the dispatcher's voice. What the? And then the sound of something. A chair rolling back, a hand hitting a desk. The small chaos of sudden darkness in an enclosed space full of people who were responsible for being calm. 2 sets of footsteps in the main corridor, moving with purpose. Voices. Briggs and Reyes, the younger one. Generator should kick. It's not kicking. Check the panel. Which panel? I can't see. The sounds of hands on walls. The thin bobbing light of a phone flashlight appearing under the cell door, sweeping, moving away. Alice was already standing at the cell door. She'd moved there the instant the lights went out, not because she was planning to go through it, but because the door was the only information source she had. Whatever happened in this building first happened at the doors. She pressed her hand flat against the metal and felt nothing. No vibration, no heat differential, no indication of what might be on the other side in the next few seconds. Then Briggs's voice, from close, 6 feet, maybe 8, in the hallway. Get Miller on the phone. And Granger, now. Something's happening. My cell's not... Reyes's voice, confused. I got no signal. Use the landline. The landline's down too. A pause. In that pause, Alice heard something from outside the building's east wall. A low mechanical vibration, deep and even, that wasn't an engine exactly. Something running on a steady draw. Something electrical. What is that? Reyes said. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just a 23-year-old in total darkness in a building that had just been cut from the world, asking the dark a question. Alice knew what it was. She put her back against the wall beside the door, crossed her arms, and waited. The radio died next. She heard it, a burst of static, 2 syllables of something that might have been a call sign, and then nothing. The silence after a radio goes out is different from other silences because it's a silence that used to be full of noise, and the absence sits differently in the air. More footsteps. Miller had arrived. She heard his uneven gait coming fast down the main corridor from what must have been a back office where he'd been working late or waiting. She hadn't heard him leave earlier in the evening, which meant he'd stayed, which meant tonight was important to him. What's the status? He said. Briggs answered in low tones she couldn't fully parse, but she caught power, radios, phones. A short silence from Miller. Get everyone to the front, now. His voice had changed. The bureaucratic authority was gone, and what was underneath it was something harder and less considered. The voice of a man who felt cornered. "Reyes, you stay on the detention hallway. Nobody moves through here until I say." "Sheriff, what's—" "Just do it." Footsteps redistributing, the building reorganizing itself around a new threat assessment that none of the men in it fully understood. Alice heard Reyes take up a position outside her cell door. She could hear his breathing, elevated, not panicked, but elevated, young and scared and trying not to be. From outside, through the impound lot wall, a new sound. Low. Rolling. The kind of bass vibration that you felt in your feet before you heard it clearly. Heavy vehicles, more than one, moving at low speed on the access road, getting louder. Reyes heard it. She could tell by the way his breathing changed, shorter, sharper. "Hello?" he said quietly, to no one, or maybe to her through the door. She didn't answer. "Hey!" He knocked on the cell door once, 2 knuckles, not hard. "You, whatever your name is, do you know what's happening?" Alice looked at the door in the dark. "Deputy?" she said. "Yeah." "How long have you been working for Miller?" A pause. 8 months. Why? 8 months, she said. Okay. She thought about that. When you took the job, was it what you expected? Another pause, longer, confused by the question. "What is that? Just answer." She heard him shift his weight. "Not exactly. No." "But you stayed." "I needed the job." "I understand that," she said. Outside, the vehicles had stopped. She could hear them idling now, not far, maybe 70 feet. The particular idle of diesel engines at low RPM, the kind of vehicles that were built for something beyond road use. "Deputy," she said. "Yeah." "When this is over, someone is going to ask you questions. About tonight. About the last 8 months." She kept her voice level and even, nothing threatening in it, just information being transferred. "The answers you give are going to matter a great deal, not just legally, but for what kind of person you are when this is done." "You're scaring me," he said. He said it plainly, without shame, which she found, obscurely, hopeful. "Good," she said. "Fear is information. Use it." Outside, the idling stopped. The vehicles had shut down. And in the silence that followed, a silence so complete it had weight, she heard, from somewhere above and to the east, the faint sound of something she recognized from too many operations on too many rooftops in too many countries to mistake it for anything else. The soft, mechanical whisper of a high-powered optic system cycling to active mode. Reyes heard it too, or heard something. He couldn't have known what it was, but the sound reached whatever primal part of the human brain registers threat, and his breathing went very quiet and very still. "Oh," he said, just the word. Just the shape of a young man understanding, all at once, that whatever was happening was several magnitudes larger than the plan he'd been handed 8 months ago when he signed on to a job that needed doing. The front of the building erupted in white light. Not an explosion, a tactical lighting deployment, the kind that hit the exterior walls of a structure and turned night into a flat, shadowless noon in the space of half a second. Alice saw it as a bar of light under her cell door, searing and absolute, slicing the darkness of the corridor into before and after. From the front of the building, she heard voices. Not Miller's, not Briggs's, not anyone she'd heard inside this structure. New voices, coming through the walls with the clarity of people who had the equipment and the position to project. She couldn't make out every word, but she heard clearly the phrase, "Step away from the windows." And she heard clearly, "Federal jurisdiction." And she heard very clearly the sound of Miller, the sheriff of Oak Haven County for 19 years, the man who had sat across from her in a diner like he owned the county because he believed that he did. She heard Boyd Miller say, in a voice that had lost every layer it usually carried, "What in the hell?" Alice sat down on the edge of the cot. She put her cuffed hands in her lap. She thought about the cherry pie she hadn't finished at the diner, and the bad coffee she hadn't minded, and the particular quality of light on Highway 87 in the late afternoon before all of this started. She thought about the young deputy outside her door, who was standing in a hallway full of tactical light and federal voices, and the weight of 8 months of decisions he hadn't fully understood until tonight. She thought about what came next. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. Not yet. It was the specific feeling of a situation that had been allowed to develop to its natural conclusion. Not forced, not rushed, but brought along patiently until the truth of it was unavoidable. Outside, a new voice, command level, calm with the particular calm of someone who did not need to raise it, said something she couldn't fully make out through the wall, but whose tone she recognized. She'd heard that tone before, in very different places, for very different purposes, but always meaning the same thing. The room is yours now. From outside the cell door, Reyes hadn't moved. She could tell by the sound of him, that particular human stillness that happens when a person has stopped processing options and is just waiting for the world to tell them what to do next. His breathing was shallow and fast, and she could hear the slight squeak of his boots on the concrete floor each time his weight shifted involuntarily. The white light from under the door hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had gotten brighter. She heard Miller at the front of the building, his voice coming through walls and doors in fragments, stripped of everything except the raw edge of a man who'd spent 19 years building something and was watching it come apart in real time. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. The cadence said everything, short sentences, rising pitch on the third word. The syntax of someone who keeps starting arguments they don't know how to finish. Then a new voice cut through, not loud, not theatrical, just the flat authority of someone whose volume didn't need amplification because the room had already reorganized itself around them. Whatever that voice said, Miller stopped talking. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then Briggs said, Sheriff, there are lasers on the windows." And Miller said nothing. Reyes made a sound outside the cell door. Not quite a word, just breath shaped by the throat into something close to a question. And then his footsteps moved quickly toward the main corridor. Alice stood, walked to the door, put her ear to the cold metal. She heard the front doors of the building open. Not kicked, opened. The difference was meaningful. Kicking was for situations where the people inside were threats. Opening meant the people inside had already been assessed as something else, something manageable. Heavy footsteps came through. Multiple. Moving with the compressed precision of a unit that had done this exact sequence enough times that each person's role in it was automatic. She stepped back from the door and stood in the center of the cell. Waited. The lock on her cell door disengaged at 2:31 a.m. The door swung inward, and the white tactical light from the corridor came with it, brutal after the total dark, and Alice turned her face slightly until her eyes adjusted. A deliberate, controlled response rather than flinching, though the distinction probably looked the same to anyone watching. The man in the doorway was wearing tactical gear that didn't have visible insignia. Helmet, earpiece, a plate carrier that had seen actual field use. She could tell by the wear pattern on the cummerbund straps, the slight discoloration along the lower edge that didn't come from training. His weapon was down and indexed, not raised, which was the correct posture for a room containing a person he was there to help. He looked at her for half a second with the professional assessment of someone confirming they had the right person. "Reese," he said. "Yeah," she said. He stepped aside from the doorway. Behind him, in the corridor, she saw 3 more operators in similar kit taking up positions along the wall, with the quiet efficiency of people who were done with the hard part of the evening and were now doing the administrative portion. Reyes was against the far wall with his hands visible and an expression that had gone somewhere past fear into the white, featureless state on the other side of it. She walked out of the cell. The corridor felt different with the tactical lights running, smaller, somehow, despite the added illumination. Spaces revealed themselves fully in that kind of light. Every corner and crack and piece of aging infrastructure made flat and factual and stripped of the particular weight they'd accumulated over the previous hours. A second man was moving down the corridor toward her. No helmet, removed it, or had never put it on, or was senior enough that the risk calculus was different for him. Late 50s. A face that had the specific quality of someone who'd spent decades outside in various climates, and it showed in the texture of his skin, the permanent slight squint around his eyes. He was carrying her duffel bag from the diner, which meant someone had gone back for it, which meant this operation had moving pieces she hadn't seen. He reached her and stopped, looked at the cuffs. "Keys," he said, to no one in particular. One of the operators produced them without being asked twice and handed them over, and the man unlocked Alice's cuffs with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was a minor mechanical problem, rather than anything else. He dropped the cuffs on the floor without looking where they landed. He handed her the duffel. "Chief Hayes," she said. "Reese." He looked at her with the flat, non-emotive expression of a man who'd learned to keep his face still in front of subordinates and couldn't entirely switch it off. "You doing okay?" "I'm fine." "You look fine." He glanced at the cell door behind her, then back. "Hands." She held them out. He looked at the marks from the cuffs. Red pressure lines, slight swelling at the wrist bones. With the brief, clinical attention of someone checking a piece of equipment for damage. Apparently satisfied, he stepped back. "Walk with me," he said. The main corridor of the sheriff's department looked different under federal control. Miller and Granger were in the room that had been the bullpen, a shared workspace with 4 desks and filing cabinets and a whiteboard. Someone had written shift schedules on 3 weeks ago and never erased. They were seated. Not cuffed, not yet, but seated in that particular way that people sit when someone with more authority than they've ever encountered in person has told them to sit and stay, and the doing of it has taken something out of them. Briggs was in the corner with an operator beside him, not close but present in the way that presence was its own kind of instruction. Reyes, she found him when she came through because she'd been tracking him in her mind as a variable that mattered. Reyes was near the front door, separated from the others, and an agent in a jacket with actual visible federal credentials was talking to him quietly. Reyes was listening with the focused, terrified attention of a young man who has just realized that the decisions he makes in the next 20 minutes are going to define a significant portion of his future. She didn't stop walking. Didn't let her gaze catch on any of them too long. Hayes took her through to the side office. What had been Miller's, from the look of it, the desk with the full coffee mug and the framed citation on the wall and the particular accumulation of personal effects that said this space belongs to someone who has stopped seeing it, and closed the door. A woman was already in the room, younger than Hayes by 20 years, with the compact, watchful quality of someone who'd come up through intelligence work rather than field operations. She had a laptop open on the desk and a phone to her ear, which she lowered when they came in. "That's her," the woman said, to the phone, not to Hayes. She listened for a moment. "Copy that." She ended the call and set the phone down and looked at Alice with the same professional assessment as everyone else Alice had encountered tonight, except hers had more layers to it. "Special Agent Carver," Hayes said. "She's running the investigation." "Running it from where?" Alice said. "FBI Anti-Corruption Task Force," Carver said. "Southwestern Division. We've had active surveillance on Miller and Granger for 11 months. She paused. "Your appearance here tonight was unexpected." "I was getting coffee," Alice said. Something shifted very slightly in Carver's expression. Not a smile exactly, but the vicinity of one. "You were getting coffee," she said. "And pie. I didn't finish the pie." Hayes made a sound that was not quite anything. He moved to the window. The blinds were closed, light from outside pressing through the slats in flat white lines, and stood with his hands behind his back, which was his natural resting position, and which Alice had always privately thought made him look like he was waiting for a firing squad, which she had never said to him. "Walk me through it," Carver said. "From your perspective, what happened when you arrived?" Alice sat in the chair across the desk. Miller's chair, she noted, facing inward now toward whoever occupied his desk, which was the natural reversal, and went through it methodically. The diner, the observation of the man at the counter, the staged arrival of the units, the evidence planting she'd inferred from the sequencing of events, the confession document already prepared, the fingerprint delay, and Granger's reaction to the flag. She kept it factual and linear, no editorializing. Carver took notes by hand on a yellow legal pad, which Alice respected. Hand notes were harder to subpoena and had different evidentiary status than digital records, which meant Carver understood the practical dimensions of what she was building. When Alice finished, Carver looked at what she'd written. "The confession document," she said. "You saw it clearly." Typed, her name in 3 locations, vehicle information accurate, date current. Language consistent with a pre-prepared template rather than a document generated in response to what I said in that room. "Meaning they had it before you came in?" Meaning they had it before I arrived in Okehaven, Alice said. Carver looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the blinds. That's consistent with our surveillance material, Carver said, back to Alice. We have evidence of at least 14 similar incidents in the past 2 years. Travelers passing through. Vehicles selected. We believe based on a network of informants along 87 and the connecting routes who flag certain profiles. What profiles? Alice said. People traveling alone. Older vehicles without modern tracking infrastructure. People who appear to be outside conventional support networks. Carver's voice was level and precise. People who wouldn't be immediately missed. Alice thought about this. She thought about the diner, the quality of light, Darlene with the dish towel, watching from the doorway with an expression that wanted to say something. How many of the 14 were successfully prosecuted? She said. Carver paused. Successfully from Miller's perspective, he was the prosecution. 8. The subjects accepted plea arrangements in most cases. 2 went to county trial and were convicted on evidence we now believe was fabricated. Where are they? One was released 14 months ago, time served on a reduced charge. The other... Carver's voice didn't change, but something around her eyes did. Still incarcerated, pending a review, we're now in a position to accelerate significantly. Alice looked at the legal pad. The vehicle, she said. My Bronco. What did they put in it? Our people are processing it now, Carver said. Based on previous cases, Pieta packaged fentanyl in factory-sealed compartments hidden in the spare tire well or behind the rear seat panel. Amounts large enough for a trafficking charge, small enough to be plausibly overlooked during normal driving. She looked at Alice directly. You didn't know? I suspected. I didn't know the specific method. How did you infer planting? The timeline, Alice said. Granger had that document ready before my prints cleared, before any verification of any kind. The charge was decided before the evidence was found, which means the evidence was placed before I sat down in that diner. She paused. Also, Granger's hands were shaking during the first interrogation. Men's hands shake when they've done something they can't take back and they're waiting to see if it works. Carver wrote something on the legal pad. I want to ask you something, Alice said. Go ahead. My route through here, who knew it? A different quality of silence settled in the room. Hayes turned from the window. Carver set down her pen. That's an open question, Carver said carefully. It's a question you've had for 11 months and haven't answered, Alice said. Yes, because answering it means the network extends somewhere you weren't expecting it to extend. And Carver looked at her for a moment. We're working on that. I'll need a briefing, Alice said. Not tonight, but before I leave the area. Another pause. Hayes and Carver exchanged a look. The compact, wordless communication of people who'd worked together long enough to conduct arguments without speaking. That's an unusual request, Carver said. I'm an unusual person to have accidentally walked into your 11-month investigation, Alice said. They gave her a room in a federal vehicle, one of the black trucks she'd heard from inside the cell, now parked in the impound lot with its running lights on. It had a small operational compartment in the rear with fold-down benches and a narrow table and a coffee maker that looked newer than anything else in it. The coffee was significantly better than the diner's. She sat with it and felt for the first time since 4:17 in the afternoon the particular unwinding of maintained tension, not full relaxation, not the dropping of guard, but the slight giving way of something that had been held at operational level for hours past, when most people could sustain it. Her body knew the difference between the threat being active and the threat being contained, even when her mind was still running assessment loops. She rotated her wrists. The marks from the cuffs were already fading. She healed fast, always had, something about circulation or pain threshold, or the simple fact that she'd been marked by worse things than steel and moved on. Hayes came in at 3:15, ducking the low door frame, and sat across from her with his own cup. He looked at her with the expression he used when he was doing the internal accounting. He never quite articulated. The specific calculus that senior operators did when they'd retrieved someone from a situation and were tallying the costs of the situation against what they knew of the person's condition. You should have called it in, he said, not accusatory, just factual. My phone was off. Protocol? I know the protocol, Hayes. My phone was off because I was on leave and I was trying to have one day where nobody needed anything from me. She looked at her coffee. I didn't expect to need backup getting cherry pie. He was quiet for a moment. The sat phone was in your bag. The sat phone was in my bag inside the diner while I was in cuffs in a holding cell, she said. Yes. You could have gotten a message out. Through what? Through the deputy. The young one, Reyes. You had conversation with him. She looked at Hayes. He was scared and confused and in over his head through no fault of his own. I wasn't going to use him as a relay. Hayes nodded once, looked at his coffee. The particular nod of someone who'd expected that answer and found it confirmed something they'd already decided. Carver wants you attached to the investigation through the debrief phase, he said. Your testimony on the in-custody conduct is significant. The confession document, the fingerprint timeline, that's material evidence of procedural violation. I know. Means staying in the area, 3-4 days minimum. There's a motel on 87, she said. I saw it coming in. Sign said vacancy. We've got a safe house. I'd rather the motel, she said. Hayes considered this. Fine. He didn't push it, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. He understood the difference between protocol and necessity and didn't confuse the two. The name, she said. The informant in the network who flagged me. I need that name. Hayes set down his cup. Reese, someone knew my route, Hayes. Someone knew I'd be on 87 today, which means someone with access to information about my movements fed that to Miller's network. I need to know who. That's Carver's investigation. It's also my life, she said. He looked at her, the flat, still face. Then something beneath it. Not soft, nothing as simple as soft, but something that acknowledged what she'd just said and its weight. I'll talk to Carver, he said. Tonight. Tonight, he agreed. He stood, paused at the door, turned back with the half-turn of someone who'd remembered something they'd almost decided not to say. For what it's worth, he said. The way you handled in there. Don't, she said. He stopped. I don't need it, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. I did what the situation required. It doesn't need framing. Hayes looked at her for a moment. No, he said, it doesn't. And he ducked back through the door and was gone. Alice sat with the coffee. Outside, through the thin wall of the vehicle, she could hear the operational sounds of the scene concluding. Voices giving instructions, equipment being handled, the particular organized noise of a federal action moving from execution phase into documentation phase. In a few hours, when the sun came up over flat Texas and turned everything that particular shade of early gold, this impound lot was going to be full of agents and evidence bags and people doing careful, deliberate work that would eventually result in 2 men in suits standing before a federal judge. She thought about the 8 people who'd sat in that cell before her. She thought about the one who was still incarcerated somewhere, waiting for a review that was now going to happen faster. She thought about Darlene in the diner doorway, with her dish towel and her silence. She picked up her coffee and held it with both hands and let herself be tired, just for a minute, the way you could only allow yourself to be tired once the work was done and not before, because before it cost too much. Just for a minute. The coffee was good. She finished the coffee at 3:40 a.m. The cup was still warm when she set it down, and she sat for another minute with her hands flat on the table, palms down, feeling the slight vibration of the vehicle's systems. The ventilation, the electronics, the low hum of something that was always running in these trucks, regardless of whether the engine was on. She'd spent enough time in the back of vehicles like this to find the sound familiar in the way that institutional sounds became familiar. Not comforting, exactly, but known. She picked up her duffel from the bench beside her and inventoried it by touch and memory. Clothes, undisturbed. Medical kit, present and sealed. Field notebook, untouched. The small tell she'd left, a single page folded at a specific angle, was still as she'd placed it, meaning nobody had gone through the bag with any sophistication, even if they'd looked inside. The sat phone was at the bottom, still off, its hardware case smooth and cold under her fingers. She didn't turn it on, not yet. Outside, the operational noise had thinned. The bulk of the tactical unit had relocated. She could hear engines on the main road, the sound of heavy vehicles moving away in sequence, which meant the scene was transitioning from active to secured, and the primary personnel were standing down. What remained was the documentation crew and the agents doing the slow, careful work of evidence collection that would take until morning and probably well past it. She put the duffel on the floor, stretched out on the bench with her jacket folded under her head, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She woke at 6:52 a.m. to the sound of raised voices. Not inside the vehicle, outside, across the impound lot, coming from the direction of the sheriff's department's rear entrance. She was upright and oriented before the second exchange of words. The transition from sleep to full awareness happening in the practiced way that didn't announce itself just arrived. 2 voices. One she recognized as Carver's, clipped, controlled, the specific timbre of someone keeping their composure against pressure. The other was male, unfamiliar, carrying the particular quality of institutional authority that wasn't local. Not Texas, not federal field agent. Something administrative, something that had flown in. She put on her jacket, picked up the duffel, and opened the vehicle door. The Texas morning was already warm, the sky a flat pale blue that promised heat by 9. The impound lot held her Bronco. Processed now, she could see the evidence markers around the rear wheel well and the slightly disturbed angle of the tailgate, and 3 federal vehicles, and at the rear entrance of the building, Carver and a man in a suit that was too clean for field work. The man was holding a tablet and pointing at something on it while Carver stood with her arms crossed, and her jaw set in the way of someone who had been standing in this exact position long enough that her patience had moved through its normal range and come out the other side into something colder. Alice walked toward them. Neither noticed her approach until she was 10 feet out, which told her the conversation was absorbing more of their attention than field awareness guidelines would have recommended. The man in the suit noticed her first. He looked at her with the brief, assessing scan of someone running a quick threat assessment, not the trained kind, the instinctive kind, and then looked at Carver. "This is Reese," Carver said. It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement of fact delivered with the slight emphasis of someone using a name as a tactical instrument. The man looked at Alice again. His expression recalibrated. Something she'd seen the previous night on Granger's face, that same backward rerun of assumptions. "Deputy Assistant Director Fowler," he said. "DOJ Oversight." "Alice Reese," she said. "I know who you are." He said it without warmth or hostility, just the flat efficiency of someone managing a situation they hadn't expected to arrive at this particular address. "I need to speak with Agent Carver privately. If you could—" "She stays," Carver said. Fowler looked at Carver. "She's a material witness to everything that happened in that building last night," Carver said. "Her testimony is central to the evidence of procedural violation. If you're here to talk about the case, she's part of the conversation." A pause. Fowler looked at his tablet, then at Alice, then at Carver. "Fine," he said, with the clipped resignation of someone conceding a procedural point while reserving judgment on the larger argument. "There's a situation." They went inside. Not to Miller's office. That was still active with evidence processing. They ended up in the break room, which smelled of old coffee and someone's forgotten lunch from 3 days ago, with a table that had one leg shimmed with a folded paper towel. Carver sat. Fowler stood near the door in the way of someone who wanted to maintain the option of a quick exit. Alice took the chair against the wall, the one with the clear sight line to both the door and the window above the sink. Fowler pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward Carver. "This came in at 4 this morning," he said. "Flagged through DOJ channels, copied to FBI leadership, copied to DIA." Carver looked at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but her stillness became a different kind of still. The kind that happened when something confirmed a suspicion that had been running quietly in the background for a long time. She slid the tablet across the table to Alice. The document on screen was a federal communication memo. The formatting was standard, the header indicating interagency origin. She read it in the time it took most people to read the first paragraph, a habit from years of processing field reports under time pressure. The content was precise and had the specific bureaucratic neutrality that serious things were delivered in when the people delivering them wanted deniability about their reaction to the content. The summary: an anonymous tip received through a DOJ ethics hotline at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, claiming that the federal operation targeting the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department was unauthorized, premature, and had been triggered by the unlawful detention of a protected military asset, which, the memo noted, raised questions about the asset's activities in the region and whether the operation had been used as cover for an extraction with undisclosed objectives. She read it twice. Someone is trying to reframe last night, she said. Yes, Carver said. Someone with enough institutional knowledge to know what channels to use and enough specific detail about the operation to make the memo credible. Yes. And that someone had access to information about the operation within, she checked the timestamp against the timeline in her head, 6 hours of it executing. Which means, Carver said, they had access before the operation concluded, possibly before it began. Fowler cleared his throat. The DOJ position is that this doesn't necessarily indicate. The DOJ position, Carver said, not looking at him, is noted. Alice set the tablet down. She thought about the conversation with Hayes the previous night, the informant question, the root intelligence. She thought about the timeline of her administrative leave, who had signed off on it, who had access to her movement protocols. Who filed the leave paperwork, she said. Carver looked at her. That's it. Who filed it? Who approved the protocol terms? Who had visibility on my projected route? A silence. Carver and Fowler exchanged a look that confirmed this was a conversation they'd already started having somewhere else before coming into this room. That question, Fowler said carefully, is currently under review. Under review, Alice said, at a level above Fowler. She said his name with the same flat evenness she'd used for everything since yesterday afternoon. I was handed to Miller by someone who knew where I was going to be. Last night, that someone tried to reframe a federal operation to create noise around what happened here. That's not an oversight question. That's an active problem, and it has a name attached to it, and someone in that review process already knows the name. Fowler looked at his tablet, then at the wall. Then with the expression of a man who had come out here expecting to manage a situation and found himself instead standing in a much larger one. I need to make some calls, he said. Use the landline, Alice said. He looked at her. Cell reception out front isn't great, she said. He left the room. The door swung shut behind him, not quite catching the latch, leaving a half-inch gap that let the sounds of the evidence processing down the hall move through in soft, continuous murmur. Carver looked at Alice. You know something, Carver said. It wasn't a question. I know several things, Alice said. Most of them I'm not going to say in a room I haven't swept. Carver considered this. Then she stood, picked up her legal pad, and said, Walk with me. They went outside, around the building, away from the vehicles and the personnel and the impound lot, to a stretch of chain-link fence along the western edge of the property where a scrubby line of mesquite trees had grown up against the wire and provided the closest thing to privacy the site offered. The sun was fully up now. It sat on the flat horizon to the east like something that had been waiting and was now done waiting, pushing heat across the landscape in the particular way of Texas mornings that were already committed to the day's full temperature before most people had finished their first cup of anything. Talk to me, Carver said. Alice looked at the fence line. 60-day administrative leave, standard post-mission protocol. The paperwork was processed by my unit's administrative officer, countersigned by the J2 at my parent command, and the leave parameters, including a restricted travel advisory that specifically flagged certain routes as requiring advance notification, were filed with 2 additional offices. She paused. One of those offices had a personnel change 8 weeks ago. New acting director. Came in as a temporary appointment while the permanent position was being filled. Carver was writing. The temporary appointment, Alice said, was recommended by a defense contractor with active procurement contracts with 3 agencies that my unit has operational relationships with. I didn't know that until about 40 minutes after Granger left my interrogation room last night, when I had time to sit in a cell and do the math on who benefits from me being unavailable. Unavailable meaning incarcerated, Carver said. Unavailable meaning compromised, credibility undermined, trafficking charge, even a false one that gets eventually dismissed, creates a security review that takes me off active status for a minimum of 8 months. During which time a classified contract I was scheduled to evaluate gets processed without my input. Carver stopped writing, looked at her. What contract? I can't tell you that in this context. Can you tell Hayes? Hayes already knows the broad strokes. That's why he was 6 hours away with a tactical unit when I sat down for bad coffee. Carver absorbed this. She looked at her legal pad, not at the notes, just at the paper, using it as a neutral surface while she reconfigured what she thought she was investigating. My operation is Miller and Granger, she said finally. Local corruption, 14 incidents, evidence planting. I have 11 months of surveillance and enough material to put both of them away for significant stretches. Yes, Alice said. What happened to you last night? You were incidental to that. You were just the wrong target. From Miller's perspective, yes. But from whoever fed him your route information, I was entirely intentional, Alice said. The mesquite trees moved slightly in the early morning air. Somewhere on the other side of the building, a vehicle started, idled, pulled away. Carver tapped her pen against the legal pad twice. This gets significantly more complex. Yes. For my investigation. Yes. And for you. Alice looked at the flat Texas landscape to the west. Nothing on it, or almost nothing, a water tower 3 miles out, and the thin dark line of the highway, and the enormous pale sky sitting on top of all of it like a lid. I've had complex before, she said. What? Hayes found her at 8:30, leaning against the front quarter panel of her Bronco in the impound lot. The vehicle had been fully processed and cleared. The evidence markers were gone, and someone had had the slight decency to close the tailgate properly. The spare tire well had been documented photographically, and the planted materials removed and bagged, which meant her vehicle was hers again, legally and physically, and the fact of what had been put inside it without her knowledge sat in her chest with the particular weight of violation that didn't have a cleaner word. Hayes handed her a paper cup of coffee from somewhere, a gas station, from the logo, the kind with the snap-on lid. Briefing in 20, he said. Carver's setting it up in the front office. She wants you there. I'll be there. He stood beside her, not going anywhere, which meant there was something else. The name, she said. We have a strong candidate, he said. I can't give you the name here. But you have it. Carver's team identified the route intelligence leak this morning, cross-referenced the travel advisory filing with access logs from the temporary appointment office. He was looking at the Bronco's hood rather than at her. The access occurred 11 days ago. 11 days ago, she'd been in New Mexico, sitting on the porch of a rented cabin outside Taos, telling herself she was resting and mostly watching the road. 11 days, she said. They had time to position, Hayes said. Set up Miller's people, create the framework. And file the ethics memo last night to muddy the water when it went wrong. Yes. She put both hands around the coffee cup. The morning heat was already significant. By noon, this parking lot would be genuinely hostile. And the coffee's warmth was redundant, and she held it anyway. What happens now, she said. Carver builds her case on Miller and Granger. That proceeds independently. You cooperate with that through the debrief phase. He paused. The other matter goes up the chain. DIA is already involved. DOJ oversight is involved, which complicates things. Because Fowler is a political creature, and this has political dimensions that nobody in that building is equipped to handle cleanly. He finally looked at her. It's going to get messy, Reese. The kind of messy where people try to make the noise around the situation louder than the situation itself. They already tried that with the ethics memo. The memo was the opening move. There'll be others. She considered this. The water tower 3 miles west was fully visible in the morning light now, its legs making thin lines against the sky. My leave, she said. The 60 days. Still in effect. So technically, I'm still on leave. Technically. Meaning my obligations to cooperate with anything above Carver's investigation are don't, Hayes said. Not sharply. More like a man who saw where a sentence was going and had feelings about it. I'm going to cooperate with everything, she said. I'm just noting the technical parameters. He was quiet for a moment. The contract evaluation. That's what this was about. I know. He turned the coffee cup in his hand. The evaluation was yours because nobody else on the list has your specific combination of field experience with the relevant systems. If you're compromised or removed, the evaluation passes to someone who will approve it. Yes, and the contractor gets their procurement. And a significant number of operational decisions get made based on systems that, from what you've seen in the field, have performance gaps that the procurement documentation doesn't accurately represent. She looked at him. You've read the pre-eval report. I wrote part of it. She hadn't known that. She filed it alongside everything else from the last 14 hours. Then you understand, she said, Why sitting in a debrief room for 4 days while someone above us files memos is not the complete picture of what needs to happen. Hayes said nothing, which, from him, was the equivalent of a detailed response. Oh. The briefing was in the front office at 9:15. Carver ran it with the efficient, deliberate pace of someone who'd been awake for longer than was ideal and was managing it through structure. Present, Carver, Hayes, two of her agents, Fowler, who had made his calls and returned with a slightly different energy, still cautious but less resistant, the energy of someone who'd been told from above to observe and not obstruct, and Alice. Reyes was not in the room. She'd asked about him before the briefing started. "He's been separated from the other detainees," Carver said. "He came forward voluntarily this morning with information about internal communications in the department. He's cooperating." Alice nodded. Briggs was being processed along with Miller and Granger. The man from the diner counter had been identified as a civilian contractor paid by Granger through a shell arrangement and was in federal custody. The evidence from Alice's vehicle confirmed as a planted package, fingerprints on the interior of the compartment not matching hers, was in the chain of custody. Carver laid it out methodically. 14 prior incidents, 8 of which could now be reopened with the new evidence framework established by last night's operation. 2 convictions potentially subject to reversal. The scope of Miller's network across the county. 3 additional officers implicated in the evidence logs, 2 retired, 1 still serving and currently being located. Alice listened. She asked 3 questions during the briefing, all procedural, all answered. She watched Fowler write on his own notepad and noticed what he underlined and what he didn't. What he underlined, the number of incidents, the geographic scope. What he didn't underline, the root intelligence leak, the ethics memo, the contractor connection. She noted that without commenting on it. At 11, the briefing ended and people dispersed into the operational requirements of a scene that was going to generate paperwork for months. Alice walked back to her Bronco, threw the duffel in the back, and stood at the driver's door for a moment. She'd already checked the vehicle herself, methodically, while Hayes had his coffee, going over the compartments and the undercarriage and the wheel wells with the practiced attention of someone who had good reasons not to rely on anyone else's sweep. Clean. Whatever they'd planted had been fully removed and the space had been closed back correctly. She got in. The seat had the particular geography of a seat that belonged to her, the angle of the back, the wear pattern on the cushion, and she pressed her hands into the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the chain-link gate at the lot's entrance, currently open. Her sat phone was in the duffel. She reached back, found it by feel, and turned it on for the first time since 2 days ago. It took 40 seconds to acquire signal and run its startup sequence. Then the messages came in. Not many. She'd been off-grid by choice, and most people who had this number knew what that meant. But one of them stopped her. Received last night at 11:22 p.m. Encrypted message through a channel she'd used 3 times in the last 2 years, all 3 times in situations where the person sending it needed her to know something they couldn't say through normal channels. The sender's identifier was a code she recognized. The message was 4 words. "They know you survived." She read it twice. Then she locked the phone and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, next to her chest, where she could feel it. She sat in the driver's seat of her Bronco in the impound lot of the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department with the Texas sun turning the hood into something you couldn't touch with bare hands, and she let that message settle into the landscape of everything she already knew. And she looked at what it changed. It changed the timeline. She'd thought she had 4 days. Debrief, cooperate, let Carver build her case, let Hayes work his channels, let the institutional machinery do its slow grinding work. 4 words said she had less than that. They know you survived. Not they know what happened. Not they know you were detained. Survived. Which meant whoever was on the other end of this had intelligence suggesting the original plan. Miller, the detention, the trafficking charge, had not been the full plan. Had been possibly the first stage of something that had a second stage if the first one failed. She turned the key. The Bronco's engine caught on the second try, which it always did. The slight hesitation before the second turn was a fuel delivery thing she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and hadn't, because it always caught on the second try, and at some point you stopped fixing things that worked. She sat for another moment with the engine running. Then she pulled out her phone and called Hayes. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to move up the timeline," she said. A pause. She could hear, in the background, the sounds of the scene still active around him. What happened? I got a message. 4 words. I'm going to read them to you once, and I need you to tell me if your intelligence picture changes. Go. She read them. The pause on his end was longer this time. Where are you right now? He said. Impound lot. Engine running. Don't go anywhere. His voice had shifted. Not the measured field authority he used when things were controlled, but the slightly compressed version that appeared when something had jumped outside the expected parameters. I'm coming to you, 3 minutes. He hung up. She sat with the engine running and the Texas heat building and the phone in her hand and the 4 words sitting in her chest alongside everything else from the last 18 hours. She looked at the open gate. She didn't go anywhere. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, Hayes came through the rear entrance of the building at a pace that wasn't quite running but was covering ground faster than his normal walk, and 2 of Carver's agents were behind him, and Carver was behind them, and the expression on all of their faces had the same quality. The quality of people who had been operating on one set of assumptions and had just received information that required a new set, immediately. Hayes reached the window of the Bronco and looked at her. Show me the message, he said. She held up the phone. He read it. His jaw set. He looked up from the phone toward the main road, Highway 87, visible from the lot entrance, its flat asphalt surface already shimmering in the heat at 2 miles out. Carver, he said without looking away from the road. I see it, Carver said. She was already on her radio. What do you see? Alice said. Hayes pointed. She looked through the windshield past the chain-link gate, down the access road to where it met the shoulder of 87. 3 vehicles, visible in the distance. Dark-colored, moving at a pace that was too measured for ordinary traffic, the precise, deliberate speed of vehicles maintaining a specific interval. Those aren't ours, Carver said into her radio. Then, to the response, I know they're not. That's what I'm telling you. Hayes put his hand on the Bronco's door frame. Kill the engine, he said. Why? Alice said. Because if they're looking for the Bronco, they're not coming for the Bronco, she said. She was watching the 3 vehicles. At this distance, she could make out the make, full-size SUVs, the kind with the heavy-duty suspension package that the factory didn't offer, which meant aftermarket modification, which meant budget, which meant not local. They're coming for me. The 3 vehicles turned off the highway, onto the access road, coming toward the impound lot. Hayes straightened up from the door frame. He looked at Carver. Something passed between them in the half-second of that look, a decision being made and confirmed without words, the way decisions get made when time is the constraint. Options, Hayes said. We hold position, Carver said. This is a federal scene. They don't have authority to... They're not coming with authority, Alice said. They're coming to see what's left. Both of them looked at her. She had her hand on the gear shift. Reese, Hayes said. I need 30 seconds to think, she said. He gave her the 30 seconds. Nobody spoke. The 3 vehicles were on the access road now, 200 yards out, dust rising behind them in the still morning air. She thought about the 4 words, about the contract evaluation, about 11 months of Carver's investigation and what happened to it if this access road became a flashpoint between federal agents and people who had the resources to be driving modified SUVs into an active federal scene without blinking. She thought about the incarcerated person still waiting for their review. She thought about Darlene in the diner doorway. She thought about the field notebook in her duffel, every page still blank. She let go of the gear shift. Call it in, she said to Carver. Whatever channels you have, call it in now. Because whoever's in those vehicles is connected to whoever filed the ethics memo last night, and you want the record to show that you saw them coming and you made the call before they arrived. Carver was already on her radio. Hayes looked at Alice. And you? She opened the Bronco's door and got out and stood in the full heat of the morning and looked down the access road at the 3 vehicles pulling to a stop 40 yards out. I'm going to go find out, she said, whether they actually know what they're dealing with. She walked toward the gate. Hayes made a sound behind her, the specific sound of a man who had supervised Alice Reese for long enough to know that the sound was functionally decorative at this point. He followed. The 3 vehicles sat with their engines running, 40 yards out, doors still closed, and the morning sun turned the windshields into mirrors that gave nothing back, just light, flat, and absolute. The same light that was pouring over everything in this flat Texas county, sparing no one and explaining nothing. She walked toward them. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was even. She'd covered 20 yards before the first door opened. The first door opened and a man got out. He was built the way certain men in certain professions were built. Not large exactly, but dense, the kind of physical presence that came from years of functional training rather than aesthetic effort. Mid-40s, short hair gone gray at the temples. A jacket over a collared shirt despite the heat, which meant he'd made the decision to come armed to a federal scene and hadn't found that decision complicated. He walked toward her at a measured pace. Not aggressive. The walk of someone who had assessed the situation and determined that aggression wasn't the tool he needed yet. The other two vehicles stayed closed. Alice stopped walking at 20 yards. Let him cover the remaining distance. Let him be the one arriving. He stopped 8 feet out and looked at her with the flat professional attention of someone who had been given a photograph and a description and was confirming the match. "Ms. Reese," he said. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. Caldwell. No title, no agency, no hand extended. "I was asked to come out here and make sure everything was being handled appropriately." Asked by who? Who? People with an interest in the situation. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have for you right now. He looked past her, briefly, at Hayes and the two agents who'd followed, then back. "I understand you had a difficult night. I'd like to talk with you privately about what comes next." "There's nothing private about this scene," Alice said. "There are federal agents 20 feet behind me, active evidence processing in that building, and 3 vehicles that just drove onto a restricted access road without clearing federal personnel on site." She watched his face. "So if you want to talk, we talk here." Something moved in his expression. Not quite irritation, something more controlled than that. The recalibration of someone whose preferred approach had just been declined, and who was now selecting from secondary options. "All right," he said. Behind her, she heard Hayes on his radio, quiet and continuous, feeding information to someone. "Good. The operation last night," Caldwell said. "There are people in Washington who have concerns about how it was authorized and executed. 11 months of surveillance, a federal warrant, and a tactical deployment that resulted in the arrest of 2 corrupt law enforcement officers," Alice said. "What specifically concerns them?" "The triggering event? Your detention." He kept his voice even and almost collegial, the tone of someone having a reasonable conversation rather than conducting whatever this actually was. "There are questions about whether your presence in Okehaven was incidental or whether it was coordinated with the investigative team in advance." "I was getting coffee," Alice said. "Ms. Reese, I've said that twice now, and I'll keep saying it because it's true. And because the alternative, which is what you're implying, requires a level of coordination that would be visible in the evidence record, which Agent Carver is building, which means the implication falls apart the moment anyone looks at the actual timeline." She kept her voice at the same pace as his. "So what else?" He was quiet for a moment. The sun was fully committed now, heat pressing down on the lot with the indifferent weight of a Texas morning that had stopped caring about the people standing in it. "The contract evaluation," he said. There it was. She let a beat pass before she responded, not from uncertainty, but because the beat was information. It told him she'd been expecting that word, which told him she already knew the shape of what he was doing, which changed his calculation. "That's a classified matter," she said. "I'm aware. I have the appropriate clearance." "Then you know I can't discuss it on an unsecured access road with unidentified personnel from vehicles that haven't been cleared by the federal agents running this scene." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes was reassessing. The particular reassessment of someone who'd come expecting a woman who'd been through a rough night and found instead something that hadn't been softened by the experience at all. "We could make this easier," he said. "For who?" "For you. The last 20 hours have been, by anyone's measure, an ordeal. You're on administrative leave. You've been detained, processed, held overnight. There are going to be after-action reviews, security assessments. The trafficking accusation alone was false and documented as such," Alice said, "with physical evidence of planting, fingerprints on the package that aren't mine, body camera footage from the federal team showing the sequence of events." She watched him. "The accusation doesn't touch me. You know that." "Reviews take time," he said, "time during which your evaluation duties are in suspension. It's a practical reality." "Caldwell." She said his name the way you set something down. "The evaluation is mine. The outcome of the evaluation affects procurement decisions that affect operational performance in field environments where people die when the equipment doesn't work the way the documentation says it does. She took one step toward him, not aggressive, just closing the conversational distance. I understand that you represent people who would prefer a different evaluator. I understand they planned this carefully and it didn't work. And I understand that you drove out here this morning to see if there was a version of this conversation that ended with me stepping back. She stopped. There isn't. The two vehicles behind him were still closed, still running. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it is, she said, which is different. Hayes appeared at her left shoulder. She hadn't heard him move up. He'd done it quietly, which for a man his size required deliberate effort. Sir, Hayes said to Caldwell. He had his credentials out, not displayed theatrically, just present, visible, the statement of institutional weight that didn't require volume. This is an active federal scene. I'm going to need you to identify yourself fully and your authorization for being on this access road before we go any further. Caldwell looked at Hayes, then back at Alice, the look of a man doing a final calculation. He reached into his jacket and produced his own credentials. Alice read them before Hayes did. Defense Intelligence Agency, senior liaison grade, the kind of credential that opened certain doors and indicated he'd been sent by someone who wanted deniability but needed reach. Hayes looked at the credentials and said nothing for a moment. DIA, he said. Yes. Then you know that Ms. Reese's operational file and her current assignment fall under a classification tier that this conversation on this access road, in these circumstances, is not cleared for. I'm aware of, and you know, Hayes continued, still in the same measured register, that anything discussed here without proper secure environment protocols creates a chain of custody problem for any subsequent action based on that discussion. A pause. The vehicles behind you, Hayes said. I need their occupants out and identified, now. Caldwell held Hayes's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and made a small gesture toward the nearest SUV. The door opened. 2 men got out. Similar build to Caldwell, similar jacket, over-collared shirt configuration, similar flat professional attention. The second vehicle opened. 1 man, a woman, both in the same register. Carver had come up on Alice's right. She was holding a tablet and recording the credentials process with the methodical attention of someone building a record that would outlast the morning. It took 11 minutes to clear all 5 of them. Caldwell was the most senior. The others were what they looked like, field personnel, sent to support whatever Caldwell had come to accomplish. When it was done, Carver looked at Caldwell. You're on an active federal scene without prior coordination with the case agent, she said. That's a problem I'm going to document. Noted, Caldwell said. You're also welcome to leave, she said, or stay and be formally interviewed as witnesses to events on this property. Your choice. Caldwell looked at Alice one more time, the look of someone filing something for later. We'll be in touch, he said. Through proper channels, Hayes said. Caldwell walked back to his vehicle. The others followed. The 3 SUVs reversed down the access road with the same measured precision they'd arrived with, turned onto 87, and headed north. Alice watched them until they were out of sight. DIA liaison, Hayes said quietly beside her. Sent by someone who didn't want their name on this. I know, she said. This is above Carver's investigation. I know that too. He looked at her. Are you all right? She thought about the question. Her wrists still had faint marks. She'd slept 2 hours on a bench seat. She hadn't eaten since a gas station in Lubbock, and the half slice of cherry pie she'd abandoned in a diner that felt like it belonged to a different day entirely. I need breakfast, she said. Hayes made the sound again, the not quite anything sound. Yeah, he said. Okay, but. They found a diner 8 miles east on 87 that was not the Lone Star Junction. This one was called simply Marcy's and had no pretension about it. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, a ceiling fan that worked, a coffee situation that was meaningfully better than yesterday's. Alice ordered eggs and toast and a side of bacon. She didn't particularly want, but recognized as something her body needed after a night that had burned through reserves she hadn't fully replenished. Hayes had coffee and a piece of pie, pecan, not cherry, and sat across from her with the comfortable silence of someone who'd eaten enough field meals with her to know that she talked when she was ready and not before. She was ready after the eggs. Tell me about the appointment, she said. The temporary acting director. What do you know? Hayes turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. Name's Mercer. Alan Mercer. Spent 12 years in procurement oversight at DoD, moved into intelligence liaison work 6 years ago. The contractor recommendation for his appointment came through a consulting group with connections to 3 defense firms. One of those firms has the pending contract. Nexigen Systems, she said. He looked at her. You already knew. I knew the contract. I didn't know Mercer's name until now. She ate a piece of toast. The pre-evaluation report flagged 2 specific performance discrepancies in the Nexigen systems: field test results versus documentation claims. The gap wasn't small. How not small? In a close air support coordination scenario, the communication latency in the Nexigen package runs 4 to 6 seconds above the documented specification under signal-degraded conditions. She looked at him. 4 to 6 seconds is the difference between a coordinated strike hitting the right coordinates and, I understand what 4 to 6 seconds is, Hayes said. The evaluation was scheduled to formalize those findings and recommend against procurement. Nexigen loses a contract worth... She paused. Not for effect, but because the number was one of those numbers that still had weight even after you'd processed it. $430 million over the contract period. Hayes was quiet. And the people who put Mercer in that acting director position, she said, and the people who fed her route to Miller, and the people who sent Caldwell out here this morning, they needed the evaluation either delayed, discredited, or conducted by someone who would reach a different conclusion. Or all 3, Hayes said. Yes. He turned the coffee cup another quarter. Full rotation now. Reese, the evaluation was classified at a level that should have made this kind of targeting impossible. The access Mercer's people needed to know your route. Mercer had countersignature authority on my leave paperwork, she said. That access was legitimate. He used it. Using legitimate access for an illegitimate purpose. Which is the cleanest kind of corruption, she said. Nothing to find until you know where to look. The ceiling fan turned overhead. A family at the far end of the diner, 2 adults, 3 children, the controlled chaos of a road trip breakfast, was having a debate about whether to split the pancake order or get individual ones. The youngest child was winning the argument through persistence rather than logic. Alice watched them for a moment. 14 incidents, she said. That's what Carver has on Miller. 14 travelers. And Miller's people would have processed me as the 15th. Trafficking charge, plea deal, or conviction. 8 months minimum off active status. She looked back at Hayes. Mercer's people found a local operation that was already running and pointed it at me. They didn't build the corruption. They just used it. Which means Miller and Granger, Hayes said, probably don't know who was actually behind the targeting. No. They just got a tip about a traveler, high-value mark, route, and timing provided. They didn't ask where it came from because the tip looked like every other tip their network produced. And the ethics memo last night. That was Mercer's office reacting to the news that the operation had failed, trying to create institutional noise before the morning. She finished the last of the bacon. It didn't work because Carver had 11 months of clean documentation and because the evidence of planting was too physical to muddy with a memo. Hayes nodded slowly. The 4 words. Someone inside Mercer's orbit who didn't agree with what was happening, or who decided the liability of knowing and staying quiet outweighed the cost of telling me. She shook her head slightly. I don't know who. The channel they used is one-directional. I can receive, can't trace. You trust it. Enough to act on it. Which I did. He finished his coffee, signaled for a refill, and waited until the server had come and gone before he said, What do you need from me? The evaluation has to proceed, she said, on the original timeline. If it gets delayed now, even with legitimate procedural justification, Nexigen's people will use the delay to push the contract through provisional channels. I've seen it done. You can't formally evaluate anything while you're on leave. No. And ending the leave early requires authorization from Mercer's office, she said. Yes. He looked at her. The flat face. Something moving in it that was doing the arithmetic of an ugly problem. There are channels above Mercer, she said. Those channels take time. I have the documentation from last night. The planted evidence, the root intelligence leak, Mercer's access logs. Carver has the 11 months of surveillance. Fowler was on site. She looked at him steadily. That's enough to escalate over Mercer's head, Today. If someone with the right standing makes the right calls in the right order. Hayes understood what she was saying without her saying it. That's going to make enemies, he said. I already have enemies, she said. They drove up in 3 SUVs this morning. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'll need Carver to formally copy the evidence summary to DIA, Inspector General, and DOJ. Today, before close of business. I'll ask her. And you'll need to give a full recorded debrief, everything from the diner to Caldwell's visit this morning, before I can take this up the chain with the weight it needs. When? This afternoon. Okay, she said. He looked at his pie, which he'd mostly left alone. This is going to be a long week. It was already a long week, she said. I was on day 9 of 60 days of trying not to have a long week. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. The debrief was held at a field office 40 miles west. Not Oakhaven, not a borrowed room in a compromised building, but a proper secured space in a federal building that had swept rooms and recording systems and a chain of custody for everything that happened inside it. Carver ran it with one of her agents taking notes, and Hayes sat against the wall with his arms crossed and listened to the whole thing without speaking. Alice went through it in sequence. No editorializing, no gaps. The quality that made her useful in debrief situations, a memory architecture that retained operational details at a level most people couldn't access voluntarily, meant she could reconstruct the 40 minutes in the diner, the parking lot, the interrogation room, the cell, the overnight, the morning, and the access road encounter with a specificity that made Carver's agent write faster, and Carver herself put down her pen twice and just listen. It took 3 hours. When it was done, Carver sat back in her chair and looked at her notes and said, The confession document. You said it was typed, her name in 3 locations, date current. Correct. That document was prepared using a template we've identified in Miller's files going back 4 years. Every prior incident used the same template with the subject's information inserted. Carver looked up. The fact that yours was prepared before you arrived in Oakhaven is provable from the metadata on the file. The document was created at 8:47 a.m. that morning. Alice had pulled into Oakhaven at 3:52 p.m. 7 hours before I stopped at the diner, she said. Yes. Which puts the preparation of the document in the same time frame as the route intelligence being acted on. Yes. And the access log from Mercer's office shows that the restricted travel advisory attached to your leave file was accessed at 9:03 a.m. the same morning. Carver held her gaze. 16 minutes after the document was created. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. The air conditioning in the secured room ran at a constant low hum, the same indifferent sound as every institutional space everywhere. That's your chain, Alice said. That's my chain, Carver said. Hayes uncrossed his arms. I'm making the call this afternoon, Carver nodded. She looked at Alice with the expression of someone completing a recalibration that had been running since the impound lot. When this investigation was Miller and Granger, it was significant. 14 incidents, 2 wrongful convictions, a county corruption network. She paused. What it is now is a federal procurement fraud case with criminal coordination that used a local corruption network as a tool, Hayes said, which is several sizes larger. Yes, Carver said. Can you carry it? Alice said. Carver didn't hesitate. I've been carrying it for 11 months. I'm not handing it off. Alice looked at her. The compact, watchful quality she'd noticed that morning had something underneath it now. Not harder, but more resolved. The particular resolution of someone who understood the full dimensions of what they were standing in and had decided to stand in it anyway. Good, Alice said. At 4:15 p.m., Hayes made his calls. Alice didn't hear them. She was in a separate room with bad coffee from a machine in the hallway and her field notebook open on the table, writing in it for the first time since she'd bought it. Not operational notes. Just the date, and below it, a list of names. Not in any format that would mean anything to anyone who found it. Just the names, in the order they'd become relevant. Darlene, Reyes, Carver, Mercer, Caldwell. She looked at the list for a while. Then she closed the notebook. Hayes came in at 5:30 with the expression of a man who had done something that couldn't be undone and had assessed that it needed to be done and was now carrying both of those facts simultaneously. It's moving, he said. Mercer. The IG office has the documentation. DOJ has Carver's summary. The The temporary appointment is under review, which in practice means he's frozen, she said, until the review concludes. Yes. He sat down across from her. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who'd been running on operational adrenaline for 18 hours and was feeling the debt coming due. The evaluation. Yes. The freeze on Mercer's office removes the authorization block on your leave modification, which means I need someone at my parent command to process the early return to active status. I've already spoken to them, Hayes said. It's in process. 48 hours, maybe less. She absorbed this. 48 hours was fast for institutional machinery, which meant Hayes had applied something above routine weight to the request, which meant he'd called in something, which meant this had cost him in the currency that senior operators spent carefully and didn't discuss. Thank you, she said. He waved it off. Not dismissively, just practically, the way people deflect gratitude when the thing they did was what needed doing, and the thanks makes it feel smaller than it was. Miller and Granger, she said. Federal custody. Granger's already talking. His attorney made contact with Carver's office an hour ago. Miller is not talking and appears to have chosen the version of this where he bets on finding a procedural angle. Hayes paused. He won't find one. The two people wrongfully convicted. The review process starts formally tomorrow. The one still incarcerated. Hayes checked something on his phone. A man named Deshaun Garrett, 41, truck driver, convicted 18 months ago on a trafficking charge that used the same template document and the same planting method as what happened to you. He set the phone down. His attorney has already been contacted. She looked at the closed field notebook on the table. Deshaun Garrett had been in a cell for 18 months because Boyd Miller had needed a conviction to maintain the operation's credibility, and because Deshaun Garrett had been traveling alone in an older vehicle and had looked to the network that served Miller like someone who wouldn't be immediately missed. She thought about the particular weight of that, the specific and unglamorous injustice of it, not the operatic corruption of political thrillers, but the grinding bureaucratic machinery of a small county system eating people who didn't have the resources to push back. She thought about what her fingerprint flag had done and what Deshaun Garrett's had not. I want to know when he's out, she said. Hayes looked at her. When Garrett is released, I want to know. I'll make sure of it, Hayes said. At 6:45 p.m., Carver came into the room with Fowler behind her. Fowler had shed some of the administrative caution he'd carried since the morning. His jacket was off, his sleeves were rolled, the tablet was gone, and in its place was a legal pad, and he had the slightly disheveled energy of someone who'd spent the afternoon on phone calls that had required him to be more honest than he'd initially planned. The memo, he said, without preamble. The ethics hotline filing from last night. We've traced the origin. Mercer's office, Alice said. A communications aide working under Mercer's chief of staff. The filing was made from a personal device to avoid institutional tracing, but the language in the memo matches internal communications we've now pulled from Mercer's office documentation. He sat down. It's not clean, but it's buildable. Add it to Carver's chain, Alice said. That's the current plan. He looked at her. Owe you an apology. She waited. This morning, my initial posture? He stopped, started again. I came out here to manage a situation that I'd been briefed on by people with an interest in how it was managed. I didn't have the full picture. He held her gaze. I should have asked more questions before I got on the plane. Alice looked at him. The apology was real. She could hear the discomfort in it, the genuine rather than performed quality of a man who'd made an honest accounting of himself and was delivering the result without dressing it up. You stayed, she said. When Caldwell showed up, you were on your radio. I was, he said. That mattered, she said. He nodded once, the receiving of acknowledgement without deflection, which was harder than deflection, and said something. They worked for another hour. The three of them, with Hayes listening, going through the evidentiary structure of what was now two connected but legally distinct cases. Carver's local corruption prosecution and the emerging federal procurement fraud investigation that would require a separate structure and probably a different lead. Fowler was, it turned out, more useful than his morning presentation had suggested. He knew the DOJ procedural landscape with the intimate, unglamorous familiarity of someone who'd worked it for years, and he moved through it efficiently, identifying the right channels and the right sequence without the territorial friction that often made interagency work slower than it needed to be. At 8 o'clock, Carver called it. "We have what we need for tonight," she said. "Everyone back at 7 tomorrow." People gathered their things. Fowler shook Alice's hand on his way out. A brief, direct handshake, no performance to it, and then he was gone. Hayes stood at the door. "The motel," he said. "You still want the motel?" "Yes." "I'll have someone—" "No," she said. "I don't need a detail, Hayes. Caldwell's people are still in the area." "Caldwell's people came this morning to see what was left," she said. "Now they know. They're not going to move against a federal witness in an active prosecution. The liability calculus doesn't work." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was doing the accounting. Risk versus the understanding that she'd been making her own calls about acceptable risk since before he'd known her, and that the record of those calls was clean. "All right," he said. "I'll be at this briefing at 7. I know you will." He left. Carver was shutting down the recording system and stacking her legal pads with the methodical care of someone who treated evidence like the living thing it was. "Go sleep," Carver said, without looking up. "You look like you need about 12 hours. "I'll take 6, Alice said. "Compromise." "It's the most honest number." Carver looked up then. A real look. The full attention that the day's operational focus had been saving for something that warranted it. "The Garrett case," she said. 18 months. I had Miller and Granger in my surveillance picture for 11 months, and I knew there had been prior incidents, but I couldn't—" She stopped. "I want you to know that I was moving as fast as the evidence allowed." "I know that," Alice said. "It's still—" "Yeah," Alice said. "It does." They stayed with that for a moment. Two women in a federal building at the end of a day that had started in an impound lot, and before that in a cell, and before that in a diner with bad coffee and a half-eaten pie. And the day had moved through enough institutional machinery that it was easy to lose the thread of what all the machinery was for. Deshaun Garrett, a truck driver, 41 years old. 18 months of a life that had been taken from him by a template document and a corrupt sheriff, and an operation that had continued because the people it targeted had no fingerprint flags, no Hayes 6 hours away, nothing between them and the system except the system itself. "Tomorrow at 7, Alice said. "Tomorrow at 7, Carver said. Alice walked out into the Texas evening. The heat had finally given some ground. Not much, but enough that the air outside the building was breathable rather than combative. The parking lot was half empty, the remaining vehicles throwing long shadows eastward as the sun dropped behind the flat horizon. Her Bronco was in the far corner, pointed toward the exit. She got in, put her hands on the wheel, sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a car that belongs to you, which is its own kind of shelter. The field notebook was on the passenger seat. She looked at it. She thought about the names she'd written, about Mercer in his acting director office, currently frozen, currently being reviewed by people who had been given enough documentation to understand what they were reviewing, about Caldwell, somewhere north on 87 with his 4 colleagues, reporting back to whoever had sent them that the situation in Okahaven was past the point where a conversation would fix it, about Miller and Granger in federal custody, about a cell in a county she didn't know yet where Deshaun Garrett was spending his 473rd consecutive night. She started the engine, hesitation, second try, the catch, and pulled out of the lot. The motel sign was visible from the federal building parking lot if you knew which way to look. 8 minutes, 1 turn, the particular anonymity of a room that expected nothing of you and asked only that you be there briefly and leave it as you found it. She drove toward it through the cooling evening with the windows down, the flat Texas air moving through the car in a way that was almost bearable, almost enough. Almost. The motel room was exactly what she needed it to be. Small, clean enough. A bed with a comforter that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded into suggestion rather than image. A bathroom with adequate water pressure and a towel rack that was loose on one side. A window that looked out onto the parking lot and the dark ribbon of 87 beyond it, occasional headlights moving through the night in either direction, people going somewhere or coming from somewhere. The ordinary commerce of a highway that didn't know what had happened 2 miles west of it in the last 24 hours. She showered for a long time. Not thinking, exactly, just letting the water run over the last of the day and the night before it, until the temperature dropped enough to tell her the tank was nearly empty. She dried off, put on the clean clothes from the duffel, jeans, a gray thermal, socks, and sat on the edge of the bed. The field notebook was on the nightstand. She looked at it without opening it. The names she'd written were still in there, in the order they'd become relevant, in her handwriting, in blue ballpoint on lined paper. The simple, unglamorous record of a situation that had started in a diner and gone somewhere she hadn't planned to go. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and was asleep in 3 minutes. She slept for 6 hours and 12 minutes, which was 4 more than she usually got, and 2 less than Carver had prescribed, and she woke at 3:07 a.m. with the ceiling above her and the sounds of the highway outside, and the specific clarity that came from sleep that was actually sleep rather than the light operational monitoring she'd been running for the previous night. She lay still for a minute. Let the clarity just exist without doing anything with it. Then she got up, made the coffee maker on the bathroom counter work through its single-cup cycle, drank the results standing by the window watching 87, and sat at the small desk to think through what today needed to be. At 6:15 a.m., her sat phone rang. Not a message, a call, which was rarer, which meant something had moved overnight that couldn't wait for the 7 a.m. briefing. It was Hayes. "Garrett," he said. She was immediately still. "The expedited review came through at 2 a.m., Hayes said. The DA's office in the county that prosecuted him filed a joint motion with Carver's team. Judge signed off at 5:40 this morning." A pause. She could hear him breathing on the other end, and behind that the background sound of wherever he was, which sounded like the federal building. He'd never left. "He's being released at 9 o'clock. She sat with that for a moment. 474 mornings. 474 nights. A truck driver from somewhere, 41 years old, who had been on a highway like this one and had stopped somewhere like that diner and had not had a fingerprint flag or a haze 6 hours away. "Where?" she said. "Crail County Correctional, 80 miles southeast." She looked at her watch. "I can be there by 8:30. A pause. "Reese, you don't need to—" "I know I don't need to," she said. Hayes was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone who understood exactly why she was going to do this and had nothing useful to say about it. "His sister is already there," Hayes said. "She drove through the night." "Okay," Alice said. "I'll tell Carver you'll be late to the briefing. Tell her I'll be there by 11. "Okay." She was already pulling on her jacket. The drive southeast took her through country that flattened even further than Okehaven, the land going so level that the horizon became a clean line with nothing to interrupt it, the sky taking up most of the visible world. She drove with the windows cracked and the radio off and let the road be the road. She thought about what she would say. She hadn't worked that out yet. She didn't have a speech. She wasn't going to make one. She just knew that when Deshaun Garrett walked out of a building where he'd spent 18 months for something he hadn't done, there should be someone there who understood the specific shape of what had happened to him. Not just the legal facts, not just the prosecutorial narrative, but the mechanism of it. The way he'd been selected. The way the system had been used as a tool against him. She couldn't give him those 18 months back, but she could be there. And sometimes being there was the most honest thing available. Crail County Correctional was a squat, functional building behind a chain-link perimeter that looked exactly like what it was. The parking lot out front held a dozen vehicles and a woman standing beside a blue sedan who had clearly been standing there for a while. She had a coffee cup in one hand and was looking at the main entrance with the specific focused attention of someone who has been waiting so long that looking away feels like a cost they're not willing to pay. She was maybe 45, Deshaun's sister, based on the family resemblance that the photograph in the case file had suggested. She had driven through the night, Hayes had said, which meant she was running on no sleep and several hundred miles of highway, and whatever it felt like to know that the person you'd spent 18 months trying to get out was finally, this morning, getting out. Alice parked and walked toward her. The woman saw her coming, looked at her with the wary assessment of someone who had learned over 18 months of fighting an institution to be careful about who arrived with an official purpose. "I'm not here in an official capacity," Alice said when she was close enough. "My name is Alice Reese. I'm the person who was in Okehaven 2 days ago." The woman studied her. "The one they tried to set up?" "Yes." Something in the woman's face moved, not quite relief, not quite anger, the complicated middle ground between them. My brother spent 18 months in there because of the same people. I know, Alice said. That's why I came. The woman looked at her for a moment longer, then she held out her hand. Renee Garrett. Alice shook it. They stood together in the parking lot and looked at the building and drank their respective coffees. Renee's from her cup, Alice's from the gas station she'd stopped at 30 miles back, and didn't say much because there wasn't much that needed saying yet. At 9:04 a.m., the main door opened. Deshaun Garrett walked out carrying a plastic bag with the things that had been his when he went in. He was taller than the case file photograph had made him seem, and thinner, and he walked with the slightly recalibrated gait of someone whose body had spent too long in a confined space and was relearning what open ground felt like under its feet. He saw his sister first. He stopped walking. Renee crossed the parking lot, and Alice stayed where she was. She watched them. The collision of two people who had been separated by something that shouldn't have separated them. The physical reality of that collision, which was not graceful or composed but was real in the way that mattered, which was the only way that mattered. Alice looked at the sky. Flat blue, same as yesterday, same as it would be tomorrow. The sun doing its work without commentary. After a few minutes, Deshaun Garrett walked it over to her. His sister was beside him, holding his arm with the particular grip of someone who has just gotten something back and isn't ready to let go of it even slightly. He looked at Alice with the steady gaze of a man who had learned, in the specific school of the last 18 months, to look at people directly and assess them without the social cushioning that ordinary life permits. "You're Reese," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Renee told me, what happened in Okahaven. He stopped. Looked at his sister, then back at Alice. How they came after you the same way. The same template, Alice said, same method. Your name was already in their files when they tried to put mine in. He absorbed this. The weight of it. The understanding that the machinery that had processed him had been running continuously, processing others, before and after, moved across his face with the slow, heavy quality of something being fully understood for the first time. 14 people, he said. Renee had told him more than the basics. That we know of, Alice said. Carver's team is reviewing prior cases. There may be more. He looked down at the plastic bag in his hand, then up. Why are you here? You didn't have to come. No, she said. So why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you were in there for 18 months for something that was done to you. And the reason it could be done to you, and not to me, had nothing to do with anything you did or didn't do. It was about who had a flag in the system and who didn't. She met his gaze. That's not justice. That's just luck. And you deserve better than luck being the deciding factor. He was quiet for a moment. The parking lot was doing its quiet morning business around them. A guard shift changed somewhere, a vehicle pulling in. The ordinary sounds of a building that continued its functions regardless of what any individual morning meant to any individual person. 18 months, he said. Not to her exactly, to the air. Yes. My route, my truck, He stopped again. His jaw worked once. I had a contract, regional hauling. I built that over 6 years. When they put me in, the contract went to someone else. He looked at the sky. I can build again. I know that. But 6 years. Alice had no answer for 6 years. There wasn't one. The math of what had been taken from him didn't balance against anything available in the parking lot of Crail County Correctional on a Tuesday morning in Texas. There will be civil proceedings, she said, against Miller's operation and against the county. Carver's team will support the documentation. You should have a good attorney. Working on it, Renee said beside him, firmly. Good. Alice looked at Deshaun. What you did in there. The appeals you filed, the way you fought it, Carver told me. That documentation is part of what accelerated the review. He looked at her. I filed because it was wrong, not because I thought it would work. That's exactly why it worked, she said. He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded. Once, the slow nod of someone receiving something and putting it where it belonged. Thank you for coming, he said. Take care of yourself, she said. She watched them walk to Renee's blue sedan. He looked back once at the building, with an expression she'd seen before, not on faces leaving this kind of place, but on faces leaving other kinds of confined spaces, after other kinds of ordeals. The look of someone making a final, deliberate assessment of something that had tried to define them, and choosing, consciously, to define it instead. Then he got in the car. The blue sedan pulled out of the parking lot and onto the county road and was gone. Alice stood for another minute in the empty space where it had been. Then she got in her Bronco and drove north. She was at the briefing by 10:47. Carver didn't comment on the timing. She just looked at Alice when she came in, registered something in her face, and moved to the next item on the agenda. The morning's developments were significant. Mercer's temporary appointment had been formally suspended pending the IG review. Not fired, not yet. The institutional language preferring the careful architecture of suspension pending review to the cleaner but more legally exposed word. But suspended, which meant he had no operational authority, which meant the block on Alice's evaluation duties was gone. Fowler delivered this news with the slightly self-conscious energy of a man delivering good news he'd helped make possible and wasn't sure he'd earned the right to look pleased about. "The evaluation timeline," Alice said. "That's a conversation for you and your command," Carver said. "The authorization obstacle is removed. The rest is operational." "I know. I'm asking because there's a procedural window. If the evaluation isn't formally reinstated within—" "I know the window," Hayes said from his seat against the wall. "I've already been in contact with your command. The reinstatement paperwork process is today. You can resume the evaluation formally on Thursday." 2 days. She'd been on day 9 of 60 days of leave. She was going back on day 12. Some part of her noted, without quite having a feeling about it, that she hadn't wanted to go back. Not because she didn't want to do the work, but because she'd wanted the 60 days to mean something. Wanted to find out what she was like when nobody needed anything from her for 60 consecutive days. She was apparently going to have to find that out later. "Okay," she said. Fowler cleared his throat. "There's one more item." Carver looked at him. "Caldwell," he said. His credentials were legitimate, DIA liaison as identified, but the specific tasking that brought him to that access road is— He paused, choosing the word. "Irregular. The tasking documentation references an authorization from Mercer's office, which is now frozen. DIA Inspector General is looking at whether the tasking itself was properly authorized." "Caldwell knew what he was doing," Alice said. "Perhaps," Fowler said. "But knowing and being the originator of the problem are different things. He was given an authorization and he executed on it. The question is whether he had sufficient reason to question the authorization. He came to a federal scene with 5 people and tried to convince a witness to step back from an active investigation," Alice said. "I'd say he had sufficient reason to ask some questions before he drove down that access road." "That will be part of the IG's assessment," Fowler said. He said it with the tone of someone who agreed with her and was constrained by process from saying so directly. The briefing ran until 1 o'clock. By the end of it, the case architecture was clear. Carver's prosecution of Miller, Granger, and the other implicated officers in the county network. A parallel federal investigation into the procurement fraud and coordination that had targeted Alice, led by a team out of the DOJ main office that Fowler would help staff. The civil review of prior convictions, with Garrett's case at the front of the line. And the IG reviews, both DIA for Caldwell and whatever Mercer's office review ultimately produced. It was going to take time. Institutional time, which moved differently than the kind of time that had passed in a cell in Oakahaven 2 nights ago. But it was moving, and it was documented, and the documentation was clean. After the briefing, people dispersed. Hayes stopped at her chair. "You went to see Garrett," he said. "Yes." "How was he?" She thought about Deshaun Garrett in the parking lot with his plastic bag and his 6 years of built work, and his sister's hand on his arm, and the way he'd looked back at the building before getting in the car. "He'll be all right," she said. "It won't be easy, but he'll be all right." Hayes nodded. His attorney filed for a civil claim this morning. County liability, state liability, and individual liability for Miller and Granger. It's going to be a long process. "He built a regional trucking business from nothing," Alice said. "He knows how long things take." Hayes stood up from where he'd been leaning on the table. He looked like he'd finally slept. Not enough, but some. The slight softening around the eyes of someone who'd gotten a few hours in a car or on a couch somewhere. "The motel," he said. "You're there through Thursday?" "Through Wednesday night. I need to be back at my command Thursday morning. I'll have your travel logistics coordinated. I can drive, she said. It's 11 hours. I drove here, she said. He looked at her. The full-circuit look of a man assessing a person he'd known long enough to know when arguing was useful and when it was decorative. Fine, he said. But she had one more thing to do before she left OK Haven. She drove back to the diner at 3:30 in the afternoon. The Lone Star Junction looked the same as it had 3 days ago. Sun-bleached letters, door that didn't quite close flush. The particular quality of a place that had absorbed its role in events it didn't fully understand and returned to business without ceremony. The parking lot held 4 vehicles. Hers made 5. She went in. Darlene was behind the counter. She looked up when Alice came through the door and went very still for a moment. The stillness of recognition, and beneath it something more complicated, the specific expression of a woman who had watched something happen from a doorway and had lived with what she'd seen. Alice sat at the counter, not table 7. Darlene came over. Coffee, she said. Please, Alice said. Darlene poured it, set it down, stood across the counter with her hands on the edge of it, and looked at Alice with the direct, unadorned gaze of a woman who had made her own accounting of events and was waiting to see if the accounting matched. You came back, Darlene said. I wanted a coffee from someone who knows when not to hover, Alice said. Something in Darlene's face moved. Not quite a smile. Too much had happened for it to be just a smile, but the thing that comes before one, when the body decides that a smile is appropriate before the face has fully committed. The boy, Alice said. The teenager with the phone. He filmed something in the parking lot. Darlene looked at her. He did. Did he send it anywhere? He sent it to his mother, Darlene said, who sent it to her cousin in Austin who works in news. She paused. I heard it might be part of what gets used, in the case. It will be, Alice said. His footage shows the sequencing, the timing. It corroborates the timeline. Darlene absorbed this. She picked up the coffee pot, even though Alice's cup was still full, and set it down on the counter and just held it. I should have said something, Darlene said. When they walked you out of here, I should have... You had a business, Alice said. You had a livelihood, in a county where Miller ran everything. She looked at the coffee. Saying something would have cost you something real. I'm not going to tell you the math was wrong. It felt wrong, Darlene said. I know. Every time someone came through here and... She stopped. It wasn't just you. There were others. I could tell sometimes. The way Miller's people came in before, had coffee, watched a table, and then someone would leave in a patrol car. She set the coffee pot down with a slightly harder sound than she'd intended. I never said anything. Alice looked at her. The flat Texas afternoon light coming through the smudged window made everything in the diner look faded and honest. Nothing hidden by good light, just the thing itself, seen clearly. You're saying something now, Alice said. Darlene looked at her. Carver's team will want to talk to you, Alice said, about what you observed, the pattern, the timing. It's useful, and it's yours to give. She held the woman's gaze. But only if you want to. I want to, Darlene said without hesitation, the kind of answer that had been waiting a long time for the question. I'll give Carver your contact information, Alice said. Darlene nodded, then she looked at the coffee cup. You actually going to drink that, or are you going to sit here staring at it like last time? I'm going to drink it, Alice said. Cherry pie's fresh today. Alice thought about the half-eaten slice she'd left on the table 3 days ago. All right, she said. She drank the coffee. It was better than she remembered, or she was in a different state than she'd been in when she remembered it. Possibly both. The pie was good. Actually good. Not just the kind of fine that didn't ask anything of you, but the kind that meant someone had put care into it, which showed up as a thing you tasted rather than a thing you evaluated. She ate most of it. She left the diner at 4:15 and drove to the federal building. Carver was still there. She would be there until the case finished, which would be a long time from now. She gave her Darlene's information and Darlene's offer to provide testimony, and Carver wrote it down and said she'd contact her within the week. The Reyes situation, Alice said before she left. Carver looked up. He's cooperating fully. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement this morning. In exchange for his complete testimony about internal communications and operations in the department, the federal prosecution is recommending a non-prosecution for the period of his involvement, given his limited direct participation in the evidence planting and his voluntary cooperation. "Is that the right call?" Alice said. Carver considered this. "He's 23. He was in over his head from week one and didn't have the context to understand what he was in, and when he had the context, he made the right call." She paused. "Yes, I think it's the right call." Alice thought about the hallway outside her cell at 2 a.m. The young voice in the dark, asking the dark a question. The conversation they'd had through a reinforced door, while tactical light pressed under it and vehicles shut down outside. And the world as he knew it reorganized itself into something unrecognizable. Fear is information. Use it. He'd used it. "Okay," she said. She spent Tuesday night at the motel and Wednesday morning doing the remaining debrief documentation, her formal written statement, signed and filed, the chain of evidence for everything she'd personally observed or handled. It was methodical work, the kind that required precision rather than creativity. And she was good at it the way she was good at most things that required attention and discipline and the willingness to do the unglamorous portion of important work without complaining about it being unglamorous. By noon, it was done. She had the afternoon. She drove out to where 87 went flat and long and empty and pulled off on the shoulder and sat for a while with the engine off and the windows down. Nothing out there except the road and the sky and the distant line of a fence running alongside a property she couldn't see the extent of. A hawk on a fence post 200 yards out, watching something in the grass with the patient focus of something that didn't think about watching, just did it. She thought about 51 days. She still had 51 days of administrative leave on the paperwork, technically. In practice, she'd agreed to Thursday. In practice, the evaluation needed doing, and Mercer's freeze had been lifted, and the machinery of her professional life was already spinning up again, calling her back into the structure she'd built and the responsibilities she'd built it around. She didn't resent it, but she'd wanted to know what 60 days felt like. She'd wanted to find out what she was like when nobody needed anything from her for 60 consecutive days. Not because she was burned out. She'd been doing this work long enough to know the difference between needing rest and needing a different life. But because at some point you had to check, had to do the quiet, private accounting of whether you were still the same person who'd chosen this or whether you'd become something the job had shaped without your full participation. She'd gotten 12 days. Day 9, she'd sat in a diner and ordered bad coffee. Day 10, she'd spent in a cell. Day 11, she'd stood in a parking lot in the early morning and walked toward 3 vehicles that might have contained anything. Day 12, she'd driven 80 miles at dawn to stand in a parking lot outside a correctional facility and watch a man walk out carrying a plastic bag with everything he'd had when he went in. She thought that was still accounting for herself, still the same person who'd chosen this, making the choices she would make, in circumstances she hadn't chosen. That was something. It wasn't 60 days, but it was something. The hawk left the fence post and dropped into the grass and was gone. A truck went by on 87, doing highway speed, its wake reaching her in a brief compression of air that moved through the open windows and was gone. She started the engine. Second try. She'd fixed the fuel delivery thing in Albuquerque. She knew a mechanic there. Well, she drove back to the motel, packed the duffel, 5 minutes, everything in the same place it had started, and settled the room. Left the key in the slot by the door the way the sign asked. In the parking lot, she sat in the Bronco for a moment. She pulled out the field notebook, opened it to the page with the names. Below the last name, she wrote 2 more. Darlene, Deshaun Garrett. She looked at the list. Then she closed the notebook and put it in the duffel and drove out of the parking lot onto 87 and turned north. The highway stretched out ahead of her, flat and long and entirely her own for as far as she could see. Morning light was already going golden at the edges, the sky above it going from pale to deep, in the way it did in open country, where there was enough of it to see the transition happening across the whole dome of it at once. She drove without the radio. She thought about the Nexogen evaluation, the field test data she'd collected, the performance gap documentation, the specific and unglamorous work of making a formal case in the language that institutions required, the work that would ultimately keep the equipment honest and the people using it in the field a little safer. She thought about Carver, who would spend the next year or more building a prosecution out of 11 months of surveillance and 3 days of new evidence, and who would do it with the compact, watchful energy of someone who understood that the work mattered even when nobody was watching it. She thought about Reyes, 23 years old, starting over from a version of himself he didn't entirely recognize yet, with the full weight of what he'd participated in and what he'd ultimately chosen. Pressing down on one side and something lighter, harder to name, pressing up on the other. She thought about Deshaun Garrett driving away in his sister's blue sedan, looking back once at the building and then choosing not to look back again. She drove north for 20 minutes before she saw the Lone Star Junction sign pass in her rearview mirror, sun-bleached and slightly crooked, already half a mile back, getting smaller. She didn't look at it for long. There was road ahead, and the road was hers. And for the first time since she'd pulled off this same highway 3 days ago, looking for bad coffee and an empty afternoon, the miles in front of her felt like what they actually were. Not a direction she was running, not a structure she was returning to, but the thing itself. The forward motion of a person who knew what she was, had confirmed it under conditions that didn't allow for anything except the truth, and had found that the truth was something she could live with. Not without cost. Nothing real came without cost. But something she could live with. The Bronco caught on the second try when she'd pulled out of Okie Haven, and it would catch on the second try when she pulled into Albuquerque, and maybe she'd fix the fuel delivery issue, and maybe she'd decide there was something honest about a machine that needed the second try, that asked you to commit twice before it gave you what you were asking for. She drove north. The sky opened up above her the way it only did in flat country. And the miles went by one, the way they always did. The most dangerous thing you can do is mistake someone's silence for weakness. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is the most disciplined form of strength there is. The people who endure without breaking, who watch without flinching, who wait without pleading. They are not waiting because they have no power. They are waiting because they know something you don't. And when the moment arrives, you will understand the difference between patience and helplessness.